Hello everyone and welcome back to the Horror Hut. Before you drift off, I thought it would be a nice idea if you can leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from. Right, let's get comfy and relax and let's begin. I was driving between Talk and Glen Ellen late one winter. I'd miscalculated daylight, and by the time I passed Delta Junction the sky had already gone flat gray. I had food, extra gas, blankets, all the usual stuff, but I hadn't checked the forecast. That stretch of highway is mostly trees, no towns, no service, just miles of road cutting through nothing. It started snowing around 7. At first it was just steady flakes, the kind that hypnotize you in the headlights. Then it thickened, wind pushing across the hood, so I had to lean forward in my seat. I turned the radio on to stay awake, but it was all static, and my phone showed no bars. By the time it really hit, I couldn't see more than a few feet past the windshield. A whiteout. The road blended into the drifts, no guardrails, no streetlights, nothing but the poles that marked the edge every 100 yards or so. I slowed to maybe 20, then 15, but I kept losing sight of the reflectors. At one point, I thought I saw a pair, then realized too late they were gone. My tires jolted, crunching into deeper snow, and before I could correct, the car tilted and slid sideways into the ditch. It didn't feel like much at first. Just a bump. But when I tried reversing, the tires spun and the engine whined. I was stuck. I sat there for a while, telling myself it was fine. Somebody else would come by. Except after 10 minutes, then 20, no headlights appeared either direction. That road at night in winter can go hours without a single vehicle. The wind buffeted the car, rocking it gently, filling every scene with whistling air. I killed the engine to save gas, wrapped myself in a blanket, and told myself to wait. The car went quiet except for the wind and the occasional creak of the frame. But after a few minutes I started hearing something else. A knocking. At first I thought it was branches, but there weren't any trees close enough. It was faint, irregular, like someone tapping lightly on the rear panel. I twisted in my seat, shined a flashlight through the back window, and saw nothing but blowing snow. I told myself it was ice shifting. But the tapping came back, closer to the door this time. I locked the doors. An hour passed. My breath fogged the glass even wrapped in the blanket. I kept clicking my light on and off at the windows. Each time, nothing but white swirling patterns. My brain kept trying to make shapes in it. Once, I swore I saw a figure moving across the drift behind the car, bent low against the wind. I turned the light off, waited, turned it on again. Nothing. I dozed off at some point and woke to silence. The wind had died completely. That kind of silence felt wrong. Heavy. I sat up, ears straining. That's when I heard crunching in the snow outside. Slow, deliberate steps circling the car. I held my breath and tried to convince myself it was an animal. A moose, maybe. But the steps were too even, too measured. They stopped near my door. I didn't move, didn't even blink, just stared at the frost building along the edge of the window. Then a shadow passed across it, blotting the faint reflection of my face. Someone was standing right there, inches from me. I grabbed the flashlight, flicked it on, and shined it through the glass. Empty snow. No tracks, no shape, nothing. My pulse hammered in my ears. The silence stretched on. I forced myself to check the other side windows, the mirrors, the back. Still nothing. But I couldn't shake it, someone had been there. I stayed awake after that, shivering, straining to hear past the ringing in my ears. Around 3, I saw it for real, movement in the beams of my headlights, which I'd left faintly on for warmth. A man stepped through the swirling snow about 20 yards ahead, walking along the edge of the road. He didn't look at me, just kept trudging, head bent, no light, no pack. I debated honking, rolling the window to yell. But something in my gut stopped me. He wasn't moving like someone trying to get somewhere. His steps were too slow, too careful, as if he was checking the ditches. I switched my headlights off. The darkness closed around me. I must have drifted again, because the next thing I knew there was a scrape at the back bumper. Not a tap this time, a dragging sound like something being pulled. My heart thudded so hard I thought it might echo in the glass. I grabbed the flashlight and angled it toward the rear window. There were footprints now, clear as day in the thin beam. Human footprints leading from the trees straight to my car, circling, doubling back. My throat went dry. I aimed the light into the woods, and the beam caught on something pale, a face for half a second before it jerked out of view. I panicked, fumbled the keys, started the engine. Tires spun, snow flying, but I kept rocking the wheel until I felt traction. The cruiser jerked forward, half on the ditch, half on the road, fishtailing hard. I didn't care. I gunned it until I was back on the highway, engine roaring, snow blasting across the windshield. In the rear view, the road behind disappeared into white. No figure, no footprints, nothing but snow swallowing itself. I drove straight through to Glen Allen without stopping, knuckles locked on the wheel, eyes burning from not blinking. By the time I pulled into town, the storm had cleared. The streets were calm, a few porch lights glowing, like nothing had happened. At the first gas station, I got out to check the car. My bumper was streaked with long scratches, shallow but deliberate, running in arcs like someone had dragged a tool across it. The snow was clean. No tracks, no sign of anyone. I didn't tell the clerk. Didn't tell anyone for a long time. But I still think about the silence after the wind stopped, and those careful footsteps circling my car. I rented a cabin outside Fairbanks one winter. I wasn't moving up there or anything, just wanted to see what it was like living off-grid for a while. The place was advertised as rustic but comfortable. It had a little wood stove, a propane heater, and a small generator for power. The ad said fuel deliveries were arranged weekly, so I figured I'd be fine. The first couple days were fine. Cold as hell, but that was expected. I split wood, kept the stove going, melted snow for water when I needed it. Nights were pitch black except for the lanterns, and the silence was something I'd never experienced before. No traffic, no dogs barking, no planes overhead. Just trees and wind. On the fourth night, the generator cut out around midnight. It sputtered for a while and then went completely dead. I figured it ran out of fuel, so I pulled on my boots, grabbed a can, and stepped outside. The air froze the hairs in my nose instantly. When I opened the shed where the fuel was supposed to be, all I found were 2 empty cans tipped over on the floor. I thought maybe I'd missed a delivery, so I went back in, fired up the wood stove, and tried to ignore it. But without the generator, the propane system shut down too, which meant no heater, no water pump. The stove would heat the room I slept in, but not the whole cabin. Temperatures dropped quick inside and out. The rental company's number was on a sheet by the door. I tried my phone, but of course there was no service. I stepped outside and held it up, walking in little circles, but all I got was one flicker of a bar that vanished as soon as I tried to dial. The nearest town was 30 miles back down a snow-packed road. I didn't have snowshoes, didn't have a sled, just a half tank of gas in my truck and the warning that the road wasn't plowed regular. I told myself I'd make it through the night and figure it out in the morning. I had enough wood. I dragged my mattress right up against the stove, piled blankets, and lay there listening to the fire pop. Sometime in the night, I woke up because I heard crunching outside. Slow, steady steps in the snow. At first I thought it was an animal, but the steps paused, then shifted, like someone walking around the porch. I stayed quiet, listening. After a few minutes, the steps moved off, fading into the woods. I didn't sleep again. By morning, the fire was just coals and the cabin was freezing. My breath fogged as I packed what food I could into a bag. I decided to drive into town and sort it out, but when I stepped outside, I stopped cold. There were boot prints in the snow. Not mine. They came from the tree line, circled the cabin, then led back into the woods. I loaded my truck fast, brushing snow off the windshield with my arm. The air was sharp enough to sting. I slid behind the wheel, jammed the key in, and the engine turned over once, twice, then died. I tried again. Same thing. My stomach sank. I popped the hood, but I had no clue what I was looking for. I just stood there in the cold, staring at the white plume of my own breath. That's when I noticed something that made me sick to my stomach. The gas cap was gone. I checked the gauge inside. Empty. Someone had siphoned my tank. I went back inside, bolted the door, and fed the fire until it roared. My hands shook so bad I spilled half the wood across the floor. Every sound outside made me freeze. A branch snapping, the distant creak of ice shifting, the faint moan of the wind through the trees. By evening, the temperature dropped hard again. I rationed my food into little piles, chewed slowly just to make it last. The lantern was dim, the room flickering in and out of shadow. I kept thinking about those boot prints. How close they came to the window. How long the person must have stood out there listening. That night I didn't even try to sleep. I sat in a chair with my flashlight across my lap, staring at the door. Around 2 in the morning, I heard it again, crunching steps, deliberate, circling. Once, the doorknob rattled. Just a twitch, quick, like someone testing it. I held my breath until my chest ached. Eventually, the steps faded again. In the morning, I opened the curtain just a sliver. More prints. Fresh ones, looping around and around the cabin. No animal makes tracks like that. I knew I couldn't last like this. If the wood ran out, or if whoever was out there decided to stop playing games, I'd be done. Around midday, I strapped on every layer I had, filled a thermos with melted snow, and stuffed my pockets with granola bars. I left a note on the table, calling for help, like that would matter. I pushed out into the snow and started walking down the road. The silence was heavy. No birds, no engines, nothing but the squeak of my boots. Every few minutes, I glanced over my shoulder. The trees were so dense they looked like a wall, dark against the white. I kept imagining shapes in them, a figure pacing me, always just behind the branches. After about an hour, I heard it again, crunch, crunch, behind me. I spun, flashlight out even in daylight, but the road was empty. Still, I knew. I wasn't alone out there. I pushed harder, legs burning, lungs freezing with each breath. The road stretched endlessly ahead, just white and gray. At one point, I saw motion in the corner of my eye, someone slipping into the tree line, quick, like they didn't want to be seen. I didn't stop. I kept walking until my body felt hollow, like it was running on fumes. My eyes watered from the cold, lashes freezing together. Just when I thought I'd collapse, I saw the outline of a truck parked sideways across the road. Relief hit first, then dread. It wasn't running. No driver in sight. Just an old beat-up pickup, frost coating the windows. A length of hose coiled in the bed. I didn't go near it. I cut straight off the road into the trees, stumbling, branches clawing at my coat. I moved parallel to the road, but deep enough that I couldn't be seen. My legs went numb, my fingers stiff, but I kept moving. After what felt like forever, I heard the distant hum of an engine. I pushed through the brush until I saw headlights coming down the road, an actual car, not abandoned, not waiting. I scrambled out, waving both arms. The driver slowed, cracked the window, eyes wide at the sight of me. I must have looked half frozen, wild-eyed, desperate. He didn't ask many questions, just let me in and cranked the heat. When we passed the stretch with the abandoned truck, it was gone. No tracks, no sign it had ever been there. Just smooth white snow, wind-blown clean. I never went back for my stuff. I worked one season as a deckhand on a crabbing boat out of Dutch Harbor. It was supposed to be quick money. A buddy of mine had done it the year before and said even if it wrecked your back and your hands, you came out ahead. I didn't have much going on, so I signed up. The boat wasn't huge. We had the captain, me, and 3 other guys. The captain was one of those people you didn't know how to read. He was quiet, but when he did talk it was short and sharp. Not mean, just enough to let you know you'd better listen. The work was rough, but I got used to it. Cold wind that cut through layers, waves breaking over the side, the stink of bait in your gloves no matter how many times you washed. Nights blurred into mornings. After a while you stopped thinking about time, just worked until the captain called it. About 2 weeks in, I started noticing something off with the numbers he wrote down. Each haul, he'd mark what came in, weight, size, all that. I wasn't snooping at first. He left the logbook open once, and I was curious. Later, I realized what we were pulling up and what he wrote down didn't match. We'd get a big haul, and he'd jot down a smaller number. It wasn't huge at first, but it added up. I told myself I probably just didn't understand how it worked. Maybe he factored in stuff we tossed back. But then I caught him doing it again, plain as day. We brought up one of the heaviest pots I'd seen, and when I glanced later, he'd logged barely half of it. I didn't say anything right away. I didn't know if the other guys noticed. They didn't act like it. Everyone was tired, focused on the grind. Still, it sat in my head. We were all out there breaking ourselves for this, and he was skimming. That night, after we hauled the last pot, I was below deck changing out of my soak gear. I heard him come down the stairs. He didn't usually hang around down there unless he needed someone. I froze halfway out of my boots, waiting. His steps paused outside the bunk room. He didn't come in, didn't say anything, just stood there a long moment before heading back up. I told myself I was being paranoid, but it rattled me. The next day, I caught one of the other guys looking at me funny when I came up on deck. Not long, just a second too long. I wondered if the captain had said something. That evening, it was my turn to stack gear near the stern. The wind was up, spray coming over. I was bent over a line when I felt a weight at my back. Not a shove, exactly, more like someone brushed close. Before I could turn, my boots slipped on the wet deck. My legs went out, and the next thing I knew I hit the rail hard and went over. The cold was like hitting a wall. The shock locked up my chest. The boat was still moving, lights sliding away. I kicked hard, arms thrashing, but the gear weighed me down. I managed to get my head above water once, sucking in air full of salt and ice. I remember seeing the deck above me, the glow of the lights, silhouettes leaning over the rail. One of them threw the life ring. My numb hands barely got a hold. By the time they hauled me back, I couldn't feel anything. They stripped me down, wrapped me in blankets, kept rubbing my arms. Nobody said much. The captain just stood there, watching. Later, lying in my bunk with my teeth still chattering, I kept going over it in my head. I knew I didn't just slip. I'd been on deck enough by then to know my footing, even in bad weather. Someone was right behind me when it happened. The feeling of pressure at my back wasn't the wind. But nobody saw it, or nobody admitted they did. When I asked later who was near me, they all shrugged. One of them even laughed and said, "Careful out there, Deck's a killer." After that, I kept my head down. Did my work, stayed out of the captain's way, stayed out of everyone's way. I didn't bring up the logbook again. I barely slept, just lay in my bunk listening to footsteps overhead, half expecting someone to come down in the dark. When we finally docked at the end of the run, I walked off that boat and never looked back. My cut was less than I thought it'd be, but I didn't argue. I was just glad to be on solid ground. I still don't know if it was the captain himself or one of the crew trying to keep me quiet. What I do know is the second I felt that weight at my back, I knew I wasn't supposed to make it back on board. I was driving back from Anchorage to Fairbanks late in the winter. It was one of those drives where the highway is clear enough, but everything off to the sides is just buried, nothing but snowdrifts and frozen trees as far as you can see. The kind of cold where if your truck quits, you don't last long unless someone finds you. A couple hours north of Wasilla, I saw a figure on the side of the road. At first I thought it was a trick of the headlights, just a shadow against the snow, but as I got closer, it was a man waving his arms. Big parka, hood pulled tight, snow crusted on him like he'd been out there a while. I slowed down, pulled onto the shoulder. He came up to the window quick, breath puffing out white, and asked if I could give him a ride north. He said his snow machine broke down off the trail and he'd been walking since morning. I wasn't about to leave somebody out there. I unlocked the passenger side and he climbed in. He smelled like smoke and sweat, not alcohol, which put me a little at ease. He thanked me, said his name was Matt, and for the first stretch it was normal small talk. Where I was headed, how long I'd been in Alaska, that sort of thing. After a while, though, I noticed he never said where he was going exactly. He just kept repeating up north or a ways past town. I asked which town, and he said he'd recognize it when we got close. That didn't make much sense, but I figured maybe he lived remote and didn't want to get into details. People keep to themselves out here. It was late, road almost empty. The only sound was the engine and the studs on the ice. Every so often, I'd glance over, and he was just staring straight ahead, hands clasped tight in his lap. Not fidgeting, not looking around, just fixed on the dark highway. About an hour in, I caught sight of something under his coat. The fabric shifted when he leaned forward, and I saw the outline of a holster on his hip. Not hunting gear, not a knife, definitely a sidearm. I didn't say anything. Lots of people carry, especially out there. But the way he kept adjusting his coat to keep it covered made me uneasy. When we got near the turnoff for Talkeetna, I asked if that was where he needed. He shook his head. Farther. No hesitation. Just that one word. A few miles later, same thing at the next town. I slowed, asked if this was it, and he said, "Keep going." His voice had changed by then, lower, flatter. The farther we went, the emptier it got. No gas stations, no lights, just forest pressing close to the road. I started running through excuses in my head about fuel, about needing to stop. My tank was fine, but I didn't like how much deeper into nowhere we were getting with each mile. Around midnight, he finally spoke again, out of nowhere. He said, "Take the next left." I knew that road. It wasn't a highway, just a plowed trail that cut towards some cabins by a frozen river. Hardly anybody lived out there full time. My stomach dropped. I asked why, tried to keep my voice casual. He didn't answer right away. Then he said, "Just take it. It's quicker." Something in the way he said it, too calm, like it wasn't really a suggestion, made me grip the wheel tighter. I slowed down, pulled over onto the shoulder, and said I had to check something in the back. I put it in park, left the engine running, and stepped out into the cold. My heart was hammering, but I kept my face neutral, like it was nothing. I walked to the bed of the truck, opened the toolbox, and just stood there a second, pretending to dig through it. My breath was fogging in front of me, and I could hear the creak of the passenger door behind me. He hadn't gotten out. I climbed back in, shut the door, and said, "Actually, I'm low on gas. Gotta turn back." I put the truck in gear before he could answer. That was when he leaned toward me. Not a big movement, just enough that I caught the shape of the pistol more clearly under his coat. His voice was quiet but sharp when he said, "Keep going forward." I didn't look at him. I just said, "We won't make it to the next stop if I don't fill up. Closest pump's back that way." I kept my tone flat, like I was stating a fact. For a long minute, he didn't reply. The only sound was the heater fan. Then, finally, he sat back, arms crossed, and muttered, "Fine." Back then. I drove, steady speed, not too fast. Every second felt stretched. My eyes kept flicking to the mirror, half expecting to see headlights behind us, maybe someone following. But the road stayed empty. When we reached Talkeetna again, I pulled into the first gas station. Bright lights, security cameras, a couple other trucks fueling up. I parked right at the pump and killed the engine. Before he could say anything, I opened my door and stepped out quick, leaving the keys in. I told him, "Station closes soon. Best place to wait for a ride." My voice shook a little, but I forced it out. He didn't get out right away. He just sat there, staring at me through the windshield. Then he opened the door, swung his legs out, and stood on the pavement. Up close, in the light, he looked different, older than I thought, with deep lines around his mouth, eyes sunk back like he hadn't slept in days. He hitched his coat tighter around himself, gave me a long look, then walked toward the edge of the lot. Didn't say a word. I went inside the station, bought a coffee I didn't even want, and stood at the counter until I couldn't see him anymore. When I went back outside, he was gone. No sign of him, no footprints except the ones leading off into the dark. I filled the tank, got back on the highway, and didn't stop again until Fairbanks. We were out snowmobiling late in the season, me and two buddies. The kind of ride where the daylight sticks around longer but the cold still cuts deep once the sun dips. We've been running a line along the river, stopping every so often to drink coffee from a thermos and check our gear. It was just supposed to be a weekend run, nothing special. We came up on the cabin by accident. One of the sleds threw a belt, so we drifted off the main trail to find some cover from the wind while we fixed it. That's when I saw the chimney sticking up through the trees. The cabin wasn't marked on any of the maps I'd looked at. No smoke from the stack, no tracks around it, just buried in snow like nobody had been there all winter. We parked the sleds and walked up. The door was closed but not locked. One of the guys, Chris, pushed it open with his glove. The hinges groaned and the smell hit right away, dry animal stink, old wood smoke, and something else I couldn't place at first. Inside, the place looked like a trapper's line cabin. Low ceiling, rough bunks, wood stove in the corner. Fur stretched on frames along the wall. Fox, lynx, a few martens. All normal enough for out here. But there were more frames leaning against the far wall, covered with canvas. Chris pulled one down and peeled the canvas back, grinning like he'd found treasure. His grin dropped fast. It wasn't an animal pelt. The hair was too long, and the skin didn't look right, paler, smoother. It took me a second to understand what I was seeing. I told him to put it back, cover it up. He hesitated, staring at the thing, then dropped the canvas over it and shoved it against the wall. The other frames were the same. Human skins, stretched out like trophies. I counted at least 3 before I stopped looking. None of us said anything for a minute. The cabin was dead quiet, except for the wind rattling the door frame. I remember thinking the place didn't feel abandoned. There were half-burned logs in the stove, a pan hanging clean on a hook, a pair of boots by the bunk that didn't have dust on them. We should have left right then, but nobody wanted to be the first to say it. Finally, I said we needed to get back on the sleds. Chris nodded, but the third guy, Ryan, was looking around like he was curious, like he couldn't help himself. He pointed at a rope tied to a ceiling beam. At the end of it was a hook, still greasy. Next to it, a blood-stained tarp folded neat on the floor. I felt this cold crawl up my spine that had nothing to do with the weather. I told them again we needed to leave, and this time my voice cracked a little. When we stepped outside, the snow had started coming down heavier. Visibility was dropping, and the wind cut across the clearing harder than before. We pulled our helmets back on, but I kept glancing at the tree line. It was too quiet, no birds, no snow falling from branches, nothing. Just the howl of the wind. We fired up the sleds and headed back toward the river. The whole way, I kept looking over my shoulder. Snow swallowed the tracks behind us quick, but for a few minutes I thought I saw another set weaving behind ours, half covered already. Could have been my nerves, but I swear I saw them. We stopped once to check our bearings. Chris killed his engine, and I heard something carry across the wind. A long creak, like wood shifting. Might have been the cabin door slamming shut again, but it sounded closer. I told the others, but they shrugged it off, said I was just spooked. An hour later, the storm got bad enough we had to take shelter. We found a stand of spruce that broke the wind and built a fire. I couldn't stop replaying what we'd seen in that cabin. Every crack of the fire made me flinch. Chris finally snapped at me, said I needed to relax, that whoever had done that was long gone. Ryan didn't say much at all, just sat there staring into the trees. At some point, I noticed boot prints leading off behind the trees. Not ours. Too fresh. The edges were sharp, not rounded like old prints. They went maybe 10 yards before disappearing into deeper snow. I didn't mention it right away. I just kept staring at them until Ryan followed my eyes and saw. He swore under his breath, grabbed his gloves, and said we should move. Chris argued we were warm, we had fire, but Ryan and I weren't sticking around. We packed quick and got back on the sleds. The storm hadn't let up. Headlights bounced off walls of snow, and the wind made it hard to hear anything but the engines. Still, every now and then, I swore I caught a flicker of movement in the dark. When we finally hit the main trail again, I felt a wave of relief. But it didn't last. A mile or two down, Ryan's sled sputtered and died. He tried restarting it, but nothing. Chris pulled up behind, and we stood there in the blowing snow while Ryan tore at the cart with bare hands. I kept scanning the tree line with my headlamp, every shadow looking like someone crouched low. That's when I heard it, something snapping underfoot in the trees. Close. We all froze. The wind roared, but under it, there was definitely movement. Slow, deliberate. Ryan muttered, "We're not alone." Chris swore and yanked at Ryan's sled, told him to leave it. Ryan didn't argue this time. We ditched it and doubled up. Chris took Ryan. I rode solo. We didn't stop again until we saw the first faint glow of cabin lights from the outskirts of town. Back at the lodge we were staying in, none of us talked much. Chris tried to laugh it off, said it was probably some sick trapper who died years ago, but even he didn't sound convinced. Ryan didn't say a word, just went straight to his room. The next morning, I went out to check the sleds. Fresh snow had fallen overnight, but under the porch steps, I saw something. A single boot print. Not one of ours, the tread was different, deeper. I brushed snow over it and didn't tell the others. We packed up and drove south that afternoon. None of us suggested another ride. I'd been flying supplies into little villages in Alaska for a couple years. Most were just runs of food, mail, and sometimes medicine. The strip I was landing on that day wasn't much of a runway, just a packed stretch of snow at the edge of a river. I'd been there a handful of times before, always quick stops, unload, and take off again. The landing was smooth enough, just some crosswind. I cut the engine and hopped out, tied the plane down. No one was waiting, which wasn't unusual. Sometimes folks showed up late, sometimes they didn't at all. I figured I'd wait a bit, stretch my legs. The village was maybe half a mile up from the strip, a cluster of cabins and a schoolhouse. I could see smoke from a chimney but didn't hear much else. The air was still, except for the ticking of the plane cooling down. I walked up the trail, boots crunching on the snow. When I got closer, I noticed how quiet it was. Usually kids would be out, or at least a dog barking. This time, nothing. A couple snow machines were parked crooked outside one cabin, but I didn't see anyone around. I knocked on a door, waited, nothing. Tried another, same thing. Finally, I called out, just to make some noise, but the sound died fast in the cold air. No answer. I didn't want to hang around too long, so I turned back toward the strip. That's when I noticed footprints along the trail I just walked. They weren't mine. Smaller, like someone had been behind me, keeping distance. I picked up my pace without making it look like I was rushing. My breath was fogging heavy by the time the plane came into view again. From a distance, it looked fine until I got closer. The door to the cabin was shut. I hadn't locked it. At first, I thought I was remembering wrong. Maybe I had pulled it shut without thinking. But when I tried the handle, it wouldn't budge. Locked from the inside. I stood there, gloved hand on the handle, listening. Nothing moved inside. The windows were frosted over, hard to see through, but I pressed my face to one. The cabin looked empty. I walked around to the cargo hatch. It was unlatched. My emergency kit was gone. Not the bulky supplies, just the stuff you'd grab quick: thermal blanket, flare gun, extra rations. The first aid box was still there, but the smaller gear had been stripped out. That's when my stomach dropped. Someone had been in the plane while I was gone, and they were still around. I pulled my gloves tighter and circled back to the front. Still locked. I knocked once, light, like I wanted to test something. No reply. I didn't knock again. The sun was dipping already, shadows stretching over the snow. I didn't want to be standing exposed in the open, so I walked toward a line of trees past the strip, keeping the plane in view. From there, I could watch without being watched as easy. Minutes dragged. My toes started going numb. I kept scanning the village trail, the tree line, the ridge above. Once, I swore I saw a figure shift behind the cabin nearest the strip, but it might have been smoke or snow blowing. Finally, I decided I needed to get inside, locked door or not. I went back, keeping my head on a swivel, and jammed my multi-tool into the lock. It wasn't a fancy mechanism, these bush planes weren't built for security. After a minute of fiddling, it gave, and the latch clicked. I swung the door open slow. The cabin was empty. Seatbelts hung where I'd left them, headset on the dash. But the little thing stuck out. My logbook had been flipped open, not the page I'd left it on. A pencil rolled on the floor. I grabbed the headset, shoved it on, and tried the radio. Static. No reply from any channel. Either someone had killed the power to the radio or I was too far out for a response. I shut the door behind me, locked it from the inside this time, and sat with my back against it, just listening. Nothing. Then, faint under the wind against the fuselage, I heard snow crunch. Slow steps circling. I froze. Didn't dare move. Whoever it was stopped under the wing. I could hear the faint creak of metal shifting. Then silence. I sat there for what felt like an hour, heart hammering, until I finally worked up the nerve to peek out the side window. Nobody. Just pale snow, blowing in little curls. I didn't waste more time. I climbed into the pilot's seat and started the engine. The roar shattered the silence, and for a split second, I thought I saw movement at the treeline again, something pulling back into cover. The prop wash kicked up snow, blinding me as I taxied onto the strip. I gave it full throttle and prayed the path was clear. The plane jolted, lifted, and I climbed hard into the gray sky. When I leveled out, I checked the rearview mirror bolted above the dash. Something dark was smeared along the tail, looked like a handprint, streaked where the wind was tearing at it. I didn't look back again. When I landed at the next town over, I went straight to the trooper's post and told them what happened. They drove a snow machine team out the next day, but when they came back, they didn't say much. Just that the cabin I'd seen signs of life, it was empty. Tracks everywhere, leading into the trees. I never flew to that strip again. We weren't even planning to go that far off the trail. It was late March, the days were a little longer, but it was still real winter in Alaska. There were 3 of us, just a weekend trip out near the Talkeetnas. Snowshoes, packs, nothing fancy. The idea was to camp one night, loop back the next day. We were moving slow because the snow was soft in spots, crusted in others. Around mid-afternoon we cut across a stand of black spruce and noticed an old path, packed harder than the rest, like it had been used more than the surrounding area. Not recently plowed or anything, just more traveled. We followed it, curious more than anything. A couple 100 yards in, we came on the camp. At first glance, it looked abandoned years ago. A half-collapsed wall tent, frame poles sticking up like bones. Rusted pots and pans scattered around a dead fire pit. Snow halfway covered some of it. But the strangest part was how much was still intact: folding chairs, stove, even plastic totes stacked against a tree. Usually stuff like that gets hauled out, or at least trashed by animals. We poked around. The tent smelled faintly of mildew, not rot, but old and stale. There were sleeping bags inside, stiff with frost. One had a huge tear down the side like it had been cut open. By one of the totes, I found a notebook. The cover was curled from moisture, but the pages inside were still mostly legible. The handwriting was rough, blocky, done in pencil. At first, it was just regular stuff: dates, weather notes, what they ate, how deep the snow was. But the last dozen pages got weird. It started talking about dwindling rations, how the traps weren't catching anything. Then short entries about hunger, about someone named Cal not waking up one morning. After that, the writing got shaky. Phrases repeated: meat is meat and don't think about it. My friend Mark skimmed a page and swore under his breath. He didn't want to touch it after that. I flipped further. The last entry wasn't a sentence, just a few words scrawled hard enough to dent the page. We're still hungry. I put the journal back where I found it. None of us said much after that. We were about to leave when Anna, the third in our group, pointed at the snow near the edge of camp. Tracks clear ones. Human boots, not more than a day old. They went off toward the thicker trees. The three of us froze. Nobody spoke for a good 10 seconds. This camp looked decades old. The journal wasn't new. And yet here were fresh footprints circling around it, like someone had been there yesterday. We decided to back out, quick but not like we were running. We didn't want to look like we were panicking, even though we were. On the way back to the main trail, I kept glancing behind. At one point, I swear I saw movement way back among the trees, just a darker patch shifting. Could have been nothing, but it put my stomach in knots. When we got back to where the camp path joined the main trail, the light was already fading. We still had to set up our tent. None of us wanted to camp close to that site, so we pushed on another mile before stopping. That night was miserable. We built a small fire, kept it low. Nobody wanted to draw attention. Every sound carried sharp in the cold of the crack of branches, the wind sliding over the snow. Around midnight, we heard definite footsteps circling just outside the glow of the fire. Not animals. Crunch, pause, crunch. Slow. Mark grabbed the hatchet we used for kindling. I had a knife. We all sat there, barely breathing, eyes fixed on the dark. After a long few minutes, the steps faded. We didn't sleep much. Every time the wind shifted, I swore I heard something or someone out there. At first light, we packed fast, barely ate, just wanted out. The trail back toward the car felt longer than the hike in. None of us talked. About halfway down, Anna stopped dead. Ahead of us, half buried in drifted snow, were more tracks. The same kind of boots as before. They came in from the side woods, merged with our trail, then peeled off again deeper in. Someone had been pacing us. We didn't run, but we picked up speed, checking over our shoulders constantly. My heart was hammering so loud it drowned out half the sounds of the forest. We made it back to the trailhead by early afternoon. Our car was the only one in the lot. Snow on the hood had been brushed off, like fingers dragged across it. That's when we finally started talking, fast, nervous, overlapping. We tossed our gear inside and drove. Didn't even change out of boots, just slammed doors and left. On the way back to town, Mark said what all of us had been thinking but didn't want to admit. What if whoever wrote that journal isn't dead? We never reported it. None of us wanted to go back there, not even to show someone. But every so often I wonder about those tracks. About how fresh they looked. About how whoever it was had walked right past our camp in the night, just far enough out that we couldn't see their face. And about how quiet they were when they finally left. I was up on the North Slope a few winters back, working for a contractor on one of the oil sites. It was the kind of job where everything felt temporary, your sleep, your safety, even your spot on the crew. 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off, living in prefab camps that always smelled faintly of diesel and bleach. Most of the guys were decent, just tired. But the culture was rough. Corners got cut all the time. You didn't complain, because there was always another guy ready to take your spot if you got a reputation for being difficult. One night, around 11, we were outside near the rigs in sub-zero wind. Visibility was decent because of the floodlights, but the cold gnawed right through everything. I was working with a guy named Travis, mid-30s, quiet, one of those people you could trust to get a job done without fuss. He'd mentioned once he had 2 kids back in Fairbanks. We were moving some equipment that should have required a crane. Management had told us just to use the loader and straps. Everyone knew it wasn't safe, but arguing wasn't an option. I was standing back when the straps slipped. It all happened fast, metal crashing, sparks from where it hit. Travis was pinned instantly. I ran toward him, but I already knew. He was gone before I even got close. The site supervisor was there in minutes. He didn't shout, didn't panic. Just barked at us to shut everything down and clear out. A couple of us stayed, numb, while the rest got shuffled off. They told us someone would handle it. The next morning, I got called into a trailer. 2 managers were waiting, both of them stiff, polite, pretending like this was routine. They slid a stack of papers across the table. "Sign these, and you can go back to work," one of them said. I skimmed. The language was heavy, but the gist was obvious. It framed what happened as Travis stepping into danger deliberately, like it was his fault. Suicide. That word was on the page. I told them no. Straight up. They stared at me like I'd spat on the table. The older guy leaned in and said, "If you don't sign, you're done here." Not just here. Word gets around. I sat there for a long time, pen in hand. My hands were shaking. In the end, I signed. I hated myself for it, but I signed. After that, I couldn't sleep right. I kept seeing the way Travis's body had folded when the weight hit him. And every time I walked past the spot, there was this hollow feeling in my chest, like I betrayed him. About 3 nights later, I found a note slipped under my dorm door. No envelope, just folded printer paper. It said, "Don't talk. Don't write. Don't forget what you signed." I froze, reading it over and over. My roommate wasn't around to see it. I shredded it into the toilet and flushed, but the words stayed stuck in my head. The next day at lunch, one of the safety guys sat across from me. He never usually ate with us. He didn't say much, just small talk about the weather, but the way he kept looking me dead in the eye, it felt pointed. Like he was making sure I remembered. Then little things started happening. Once, while I was walking back from the showers, I noticed my locker was hanging open. Nothing was missing, but my boots had been moved. Another time, I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of someone trying my door handle, slow and deliberate. I didn't move, just lay there holding my breath until it stopped. I stopped calling home as much. The camp phones weren't private. I felt like anything I said might be listened to. About a week later, I went outside during a smoke break. The lot was empty except for one truck idling near the far fence. I couldn't see the driver through the glare, but the headlights stayed trained right on me. I stood there pretending to check my phone until I couldn't take it anymore and went back inside. When I looked out the window a minute later, the truck was gone. The paranoia started eating me alive. I barely spoke to anyone. Even my crew noticed I was quieter, but I didn't know who I could trust. The final straw was during my last shift before heading home. I went to grab my gloves from the break area, and tucked into one of them was another note. Just one line this time. You say one word, and you'll end up like him. I kept it, folded it into my wallet. That night, I barely slept on the flight back to Anchorage. Every bump of turbulence made me clench the armrests, thinking of how easy it would be for things to accidentally go wrong. Once I was home, I told my wife only that the job wasn't working out. I didn't mention Travis, or the papers, or the notes. I quit the company quietly and found other work a few months later. Even now, I check my rearview mirror more than I need to. I can't stand locked doors rattling at night. And I still think about Travis's kids, how they'll never know the truth of what happened. All because I signed. I pulled into town because the map said there was a diner and because the road was getting narrow and I didn't trust the weather to get any better. It was the kind of place you expect in a travel brochure. One main street, a few clapboard houses, a dock that smelled of fish and oil. But when I drove in, the street was empty, like everyone had stepped out for a second and never came back. The diner sign still hung crooked, the window lit, and one of those handwritten menus was taped to the glass. I walked up the steps and pushed the door. It opened without a sound. The bell above it didn't even jingle. Coffee cups sat half full on the counter, a plate with toast cooling on a paper napkin. Newspapers were spread across a table, folded the exact same way. Someone had left the radio on quiet, some old country song, but the voice of the singer was the only sound besides the tide pulling at the pilings outside. I called out. "Hello?" The word felt stupid in the empty room. No answer. The front door next to the counter was unlocked. It always felt wrong when doors were unlocked and nobody was home. I stepped out onto the salt-sprayed porch and looked down the lane. Houses had their curtains drawn. Doors stood slightly ajar. A pot of soup simmered on a stove visible through a kitchen window, steam fogging the glass. On a table beside a bed I saw a child's mitten, the kind with a cotton lining, just placed like someone had taken it off and not come back. The whole place smelled like coffee, fish oil, and something like fear if fear had a smell. I found one old woman peer up between two curtains and then vanish back into shadow. When I waved, she mouthed something and clapped her hand over her mouth. I moved closer and she slid the window wider. Her eyes were huge and wet. "Don't make a sound," she hissed. "Don't look." "Look at what?" I asked. The diner was quiet enough that the tinny radio filled up the empty space between us. She didn't answer. She just pointed with a shake of her hand toward the dock. I walked that way because curiosity is a stupid, slow-burning thing. The dock was the same as always, gulls squabbling over a leftover fish head, a single skiff tied to a piling. A man was standing on the plank, the only person I could see, and he was the wrong color for the town. His red bibs flashed against the gray morning. He was walking up and down the length of the dock in that slow, measured way that made you think he belonged there, like you expected him to be there every day. He smoked and spat and watched the water. He didn't look at me. He didn't look at anyone. People in the windows were peeking. Children pressed faces to glass. A teenager crouched behind a bakery door and stared at the man like she could make him stop by looking hard enough. When I got close, the man glanced up. He had the kind of face that had no small talk in it, the jaws and the jut of years on the sea. He smiled without humor. Up close he smelled like wet rope in the sunset. He did not carry a gun. He didn't need to. There was an authority there that made the whole town shrink back a little. "You tourists," he said. The word wasn't a question. "Just passing through," I said. "Is the diner?" He looked at the plate of toast cooling in the window as if it were something dangerous. He shook his head, slow. "Nobody's out," he said. "Best you be gone." "Where'd everybody go?" I asked, because I wanted him to be wrong. I wanted some explanation that didn't make the skin on my arms prick. He smiled that tight smile again. "They're inside." That didn't make sense. I pointed at the diner, then at the houses. Why are they?" He tapped the ash off his cigarette into the water and turned to walk away like we were done. He didn't hurry. He didn't need to. The town belonged to him whether anyone wanted it to or not. He moved with the confidence of a man who had walked this coastline alone for 20 years and learned how small other people's once made them in the face of his. 2 kids ran out from behind a shed and darted into a house without so much as a hello. A woman nearly fell to the stoop as I walked by, clutching the door frame, watching that man go. When I asked her what was happening, her voice was a thread. "He kills for being awake," she whispered. I thought at first she meant in a storybook way, but her eyes said she meant it literally, like she counted on those words. I left the dock in a hurry, and passed a grocery with its door wide open. Cans left on a shelf, a loaf of bread still in its plastic, milk sweating on the counter. A calendar on the wall had the last date circled. The handwriting in the margins said things like "stay quiet and don't answer the knock." Someone had written it in pencil, small, as if their hand already shook. I knew then this wasn't a game of shyness. This was something bigger: coercion, threats, the slow grind of living under a person who made the day-to-day choices for you. I tried knocking on doors, going up to houses with light inside. People peered at the peephole and then shut it. A teenage kid slid a note under the door of my truck as I leaned in to look at a map. It read, "Leave. Don't be seen. Call no one here." The man kept walking the wharf like a metronome. He made a half turn and his head snapped toward me like a dog hearing a twig. For a second I thought he would come over, that he would ask why I was in his town. Instead, he waved a hand slowly and made a gesture toward the road out. It was the exact same half gesture he'd used to tell me best you be gone earlier. Very deliberate. Very small. I didn't want to get in his business. I wanted to leave. But I also wanted to do something sensible, call someone, find out what was actually happening. My phone had maybe one bar, maybe none, depending on where you stood. The exchange outside the co-op had an old pay phone bolted inside a wooden box. I ducked under the awning and dropped a coin in. The dial tone was thin and brittle. I called the troopers in the nearest town and got through after 3 tries. I used the word "situation" and left out anything dramatic because the woman on the other end made the voice you get when you know resources are thin. She said a trooper could be in the area by morning, but in Alaska morning can mean a flight, and flights don't come on time just to save a stranger in a town 2 hours off the main road. While I talked, I could see him across the breakwater, walking slower now, as if he smelled the change on me. People moved inside like clockwork, shutters slid closed, a dog whined and was shushed, feet padded across floors. "You should go," the dispatcher said when I hung up. "Get to the ferry or don't go ashore." I looked at the map and saw a small dock on the far side of the inlet with a posted schedule for a mail boat. It was running in the afternoon. If I could make that, I could be out in a few hours and on the radio to the troopers when I reached cell range. I thought about staying, calling them back, trying to do something for the people who'd looked at me with those fished-out eyes. But the look on the old woman's face in the curtain wouldn't leave me. She had the expression of someone who'd chosen a kind of survival that meant leaning so far and she could no longer risk other people. She mouthed, "Please." On the walk to the other side of the inlet, I kept to the shadows. I saw a child watching me from a window, a man crouched under a staircase. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved a muscle that wasn't necessary. The man on the dock saw me and smiled like a man who had all day. He stepped off the planking and walked toward me on the beach. He kept his hands empty. He didn't yell. He didn't need to. "Going to catch the mail?" he asked when he was close enough for me to feel the salt on his breath. "Yeah," I said. "Have a seat and wait." I shouldn't be in town. The sentence sounded like both truth and threat. He watched me for a long moment. Then he nodded as if agreeing to something I hadn't asked about, turned, and started back up the boardwalk. He didn't hurry. He didn't need to. The mail boat's horn was the gentlest thing in the world, and it made me feel like a person with a plan for once. I got to the dock with the other few people who would be leaving. A woman handed me a thermos without a word and then slipped back into shadow. The boat rocked loose and we crossed the inlet. On the far shore I could finally get a decent signal. I called the troopers again, and this time I didn't fill in the gaps politely. I told them about the food on tables and the curtains closed and the man walking the dock. The trooper on the other end swore, and it was a clean, efficient sound. He said they'd get a plane in the air and meet me at the next town. We pulled into the next harbor and the trooper was there, a booted man with a notebook and a phone that worked. He listened and then wrote down names I had given him from what I'd pinned together, names I had pried from the old woman, from the note under my truck. He looked grave and said they'd been watching that man for months, complaints that went nowhere for reasons I didn't understand. He said they suspected intimidation, threats, property damage, that the man had a way of keeping people small. He didn't say he could promise arrests that day, but he said he could promise they would go back, and that for tonight at least I wasn't going back with him. I slept in a bed that night, shirt on the floor, phone on the nightstand, breathing like it was new air. Later, the troopers told me they did fly in that week, serve warrants, and make a few arrests. The town got its newspapers and its stories rearranged for a while. I never went back. I still think about the hands in the curtain and the child who couldn't look at me and the way a whole place could be kept under a single man's slow feet. Sometimes I wonder if I did the right thing by leaving, but then I remember the old woman's eyes and the way she mouthed please, and I know I would do the same thing again. We'd been following the same line of blue ice for most of the morning, me and Ben in a rope that looked fine in the sun but, in a place like that, felt too small for the job. I go into glacier country for pictures. You never get the right ones if you hang back, and Ben's the kind of guy who trusts his kit and his head. He's methodical. That's why I asked him along. The weather had been weird, warm the last 2 nights, the kind of warm that makes the snow bridges soft. We both noticed that little slurps of melt running near the surface, hairline cracks in places that should be solid. Ben kept checking the poles and the map on his phone, making that little face he gets when the route doesn't line up. I wanted the shot on the far side of the crevasse run. It would catch the light right at noon. I should have backed off then. We roped up. Ben tied the knot and did the double check like we always do. Glove, harness, loop. The rope was coiled in the sun by my pack. I ran my hand along it and felt a grit in the weave. I made a note to check it after, file it as a small thing. We clipped in and started across a shelf where the ice looked like old wood, creamy, pitted. The first half of the crossing was fine. The sled track and the boot steps held. The top of the crevasse gaped like a blue mouth to my right, too deep to see the bottom. I remember the sound of my crampons clicking, the cold burning my fingertips through the gloves as I adjusted the tripod. I remember thinking how quiet it was, how loud our breaths sounded. I didn't see the snow bridge collapse under me. I heard it, an odd hollow sound like a drum, then the roof went away and I was moving down. The rope took me with a jerk. I hit an edge and the world folded. I swung, felt the harness bite my hips, and then the harness took my weight like it was a handshake. I was half out of the crevasse and half in it, legs dangling into a narrow dark pocket, my camera swinging on its strap and banging my chest. Ben was shouting, but his voice seemed unreal, too high-pitched, like the radio was on a bad frequency. He'd been close enough to see the whole thing. He dug his ice axe into the shelf and jammed his crampon toes against the snow to break the rope. He looked calm the way people look calm when they can't think of anything else to do but be efficient. At first I thought the rope would hold like it always does. It didn't. The edge where it ran over the lip was ragged, full of small ice teeth, and the rope started to slice against it. I could see the fibers when Ben hauled me up a few inches, pale threads sticking out like a busted seam. He wrapped his jacket over the section and sawed the jacket into a buffer, pulling it tight with half his weight. It slowed the abrasion, but it was still grinding. Ben's face went flat. He yelled for me to kick with my crampons and try to get my feet into a notch. I tried. My left crampon found nothing but hard, brittle ice and my toes screamed with the cold. My right foot grazed a ledge and I dug the front points in and pulled with my arms. I could feel blood in my ears. He kept hauling in short, brutal tugs. We were a system, him, the anchor, me, the moving part, and when anything in the system starts to fail, the math goes sideways fast. I remember seeing the rope fuzz like a ribbon of hair being cut and thinking, with a stupid clarity, that if it broke there would be no if. My camera strap bounced on my shoulder. I couldn't stop watching the rope. A little white thread broke loose and flapped in the wind. Ben fumbled with a carabiner, trying to get a backup line out, and I heard him curse because the spare sling was stuck under his pack. I couldn't get my legs up to hook into that spare. My hands were a wreck of cold and adrenaline. He tried another thing. He wrapped the rope around an ice screw he hammered in, making a lower friction point. That bought us a second or two. He leaned back so hard his toes came off the shelf and his heels dug a rut in the snow. He was bleeding through his glove from the rope burn on his cuff where he tried to stop the rope with one hand. He told me to breathe and keep my weight stable. "Kick at the edge," he said. He said it like a fact. The fray worsened. I could hear a rasp, tiny at first, then louder, like a file on wood. I started to move up the rope on instinct, prusicking with one hand, the other clawing for the lip. There wasn't room for elegance. My fingers were slow, thick with numbness, but they found the cord and looped it into a clumsy knot around my wrist and the rope. It held for a second while I swung and dug the points. Ben hauled, and between the two of us we inched me towards the shelf. At the same time, the air down in the crevasse was different, cold and wet and narrow. Every breath tasted like metal. The light fell away fast, and shadows pushed at the edges of my vision. There was a slow drip from somewhere above me. For a moment, rhetorical and wildly stupid, I thought about the things I wanted to shoot, the colors, the angles, and realized the smallness of any photograph compared to being alive. Ben started to scream, not at me but at the rope. He'd taken the jacket off and was using it like a rolling pad, moving it inch by inch over the lip. The friction ripped it fast, this ragged wet sound, and down below I felt a fresh pop where a chunk of ice spalled free under my feet. The rope tightened. Panic wasn't present as a feeling. It was present as a fact. The rope would fail if we didn't move whole and fast. I don't know, I stopped thinking like a photographer and started thinking like an animal. My crampons found a hold that let me stand for half a second. I yanked with everything I had. Ben took a knee and dug with his axe, losing his shard of pick into the snow. He threw his weight back and hauled, and I hooked my left leg over the lip and swung my hips up. My shoulders scraped on the snow and my parka tore. It was everything at once, rope squealing, Ben cursing, my lungs burning, the sound of ice dropping somewhere deeper in the crevasse. The rope did snap, half an inch of fiber popped and went limp, but the kernel of it held on another knot that Ben had tied earlier, a bend in the strands that saved us because we had redundancy in a stupid, human way. I don't know which part saved us, the spare knot, Ben's jacket, my crampon finding that ridiculous tiny edge. I just know the moment my chest cleared the lip and cold air rushed across my face was one of the sharpest reliefs I've ever felt. He hauled me up the last 2 feet and then collapsed on the snow, shaking. My hands were purple and blistered. My calves were humming with the exertion. He sat there and inspected the rope, his jaw set hard. It had been cut to threads in 2 spots, the sheath was shredded and the core showed white and raw. If we'd been out there another day, if the rope had been old enough to fail sooner, one of our names would have been carved in a different way. We packed up without talking much. I kept replaying the small things, the grit on the rope I felt earlier, the cracks in the snow, the way Ben had hesitated on the map. We walked back with our packs heavier than before. The camera still worked despite everything, a little lens scrape, a smudge on the glass that I couldn't stop looking at, proof I'd been too close to the thing I wanted. Days later, in town, a ranger wrote down what happened, measured up the shelf where I'd fallen and shook his head. He called it a near miss, said we'd been lucky and we were. Ben replaced the rope the next day, buying a new one thick as his arm, and he didn't joke about the shot again. We didn't talk about the frayed jacket or the spare sling stuck under a pack. Some things you only say once, if at all. I kept the pictures, of course. The frame I value most wasn't the sweep of blue I went for, but the close-in shot of the edge, the little teeth of ice where the rope had sung. It's honest. It keeps the quiet things honest. And every time I look at it, my hands start to itch like I'm getting my crampons on. I took the job because I wanted quiet, and because the hospital in Anchorage was full of people who needed things I couldn't always give. The village clinic was 3 rooms, a lean-to of a pharmacy, and a waiting area that doubled as a place for the coffee pot. It was the kind of place where you learned people's kids' names on the first day and their grandmother's stories on the second. You also learned what people could and couldn't afford, and what everyone chose to ignore. The first time it showed up for me, it was soft, almost a joke. The mayor came in complaining about a bad shoulder. He'd been at the docks all season. He was a solid man, smiling easy, and he asked for something to take the edge off so I can get through a couple of long nights. I wrote a short course of an opioid for acute pain, the kind of prescription you write and forget because the paperwork is quick and the problem seems fixed. He took it and left. Then another person came in and asked for the same thing. The usual, she said, without a look. A teenager came in and said his back hurt from shoveling snow. His mother whispered the name of the mayor and I realized she meant, tell him you saw the mayor getting them. It clicked slowly. The same brand, the same dosage. People who had no recent surgery and no clear reason for chronic narcotics were showing up at the same request and the same assurance. Everyone knew how the supply worked and where the line was. I began to log things. It's what clinicians do when their skin pricks. I tracked pills dispensed, compared them with what the state prescription monitoring program showed, and then started asking questions. The pharmacist down the hall fumbled words and said the wholesaler sent extra. The delivery slips were vague. A ledger we found in a file drawer, one of those old notebooks someone had used to track household supplies, had brand names in it and the total numbers that didn't match any official inventory. When I raised it at the staff meeting, they leaned in and told me to be careful. The clinic director, a nurse who'd grown up there, said not to make enemies. The mayor, they said, was not just a mayor. He organized fuel drops in winter, he signed grants, he called contractors and they listened. He was the conduit. Nobody said the word supply chain out loud, but everyone knew the mayor could make things happen. People who got called out into the storm got paid in gratitude and sometimes a bottle. If I pushed too hard, they said, the clinic would lose more than pride. I did the sensible thing. I refused to give extra prescriptions without documentation. I tightened controls. I asked for identification and medical records. I switched to alternatives where I could. I refused refills when there was no clear diagnosis. At first it was polite. The mayor came by. He smiled and told me I was doing a fine job, but you know how it is here. He dropped a small threat, think about who keeps the roads open, into a sentence about community obligation and left. The first vandalism was a broken porch light at the house where I lived above the clinic. Just the bulb smashed, a week after I denied a refill. Someone keyed my truck at night. A rock hit the back window of the waiting room. The tone of those acts was not random, small, deliberate, meant to be noticed without being violent. Then came the notes. Folded paper slid under the clinic door. Keep your mouth shut. No signature. No threats that used a name. That sort of thing lands on you like a cold wet clump of snow and then melts into paranoia. I called the state health hotline to ask about audits, about protocol. The woman I talked to was sympathetic and asked me to document everything. I did. I made spreadsheets and printed copies, then emailed them to a friend at the university in Anchorage. The problem was logistics and politics wrapped together. The mayor held power locally, and the local police were thinned 2 officers, both related by marriage to families who came to the clinic. Deputies answered slowly when they answered at all. The intimidation escalated in a way that felt climbing and precise. A patient I'd sent to Anchorage for detox came back in town the next week with a swollen face and an apology, and said he'd made a mistake about something he was going to say to the state troopers. A neighbor's dog went missing. Someone left a dog bowl full of water on the dock, as if to say the dog had gone for a reason. I found my clinic files rearranged more than once, pages missing, a prescription pad gone from the drawer overnight and returned without the security stamp. At night I lay awake and listened to the wind and the tide, telling myself any small place in the world has small mean things. But the mean things kept getting personal. I woke to a light tapping on my bedroom window once and found boot prints in the drift that led away without turning back. A single boot impression, then nothing. Once I came to work and found a small syringe on the mat. Someone had left it like a calling card. One morning, the nurse who worked with me, she'd been a nurse for 20 years, came in pale as a sheet and handed me a note. She said a kid had slipped under her windshield wiper. Sign the papers, or you'll be the one missing. She started naming names that night, things she heard at the grocery, at the church, things people said in corridors when they thought no one was listening. She had the look of someone who wanted to leave but felt she couldn't. I did what little I could think of. I moved the most vulnerable drugs into the pharmacy safe every night. I started locking the clinic door earlier. I documented every request, every refused refill, every face that left angry. I told myself I was doing what any doctor would, follow the rules, protect patients. But rules didn't matter when the pattern had a face, and that face had the town's trust bolstering him. Once, the mayor came into the clinic asking for something for his buddy, and I told him no. He stood at the counter with his hands flat, like he was showing I had no reason to be afraid. "You'll want to be careful about that paperwork," he said. "You don't want to be the reason my people suffer." I said I had no interest in making him suffer, only in practicing medicine. He smiled in a way that did not include me. Then he left. The week after that, my house was egged. Someone slashed 3 tires on the clinic van. The phone rang at night for 3 nights straight, an old rotary tone and then silence when I picked up. The nurse found a note taped to her locker reading, "We're watching." The small axe wore on me. The cumulative effect was a pressure that made my hands shake and my meals taste like sawdust. I kept a copy of everything and eventually drove to Anchorage with a thumb drive. I sent the records, the spreadsheets, the photographs of the ledger and of destroyed property to the state health investigators and the troopers. I waited 2 days in Anchorage hoping the tide of bureaucracy would rush. It didn't rush, it moved the way government moves across distance, deliberate and slow. But it moved. When I went back, with an investigator from the state troopers on the phone and a voice promising they'd be out as soon as they could spare a plane, the town had a new hush to it. You could feel people looking away from the road, not at it. The investigator said not to confront anyone, to stay visible in public, and for a while I followed that advice like a prayer. The night the troopers finally came, a plane cut through the gray and someone in uniform walked into the clinic. They asked quiet questions and looked at my notes with the hard face of people who know how to file a warrant. The mayor was called in for questioning, and the first time a camera flashed on his face, he stopped smiling the way I'd seen him. He walked out of the clinic into a rain that seemed suddenly honest and washed away nothing. They arrested him 2 days later. Not everything was clean, not everyone was charged. People who'd been buying pills had complicated lives, and prosecutions took their time. But for a while the notes stopped. The van's tires were replaced. The nurse slept through the night again. I was given the choice to stay or to transfer with a recommendation letter that read like an apology for what happened there. I left a month later. I took a job in a regional clinic where the phone worked and the troopers were a shift away, and I kept a copy of my records in a drawer. I still look over my shoulder sometimes when I walk to the car, and I still have the taste of that town in my mouth like a thing I swallowed and can't spit out. But I went because I had to, because the village needed a chance to reopen on its own terms, and because I couldn't keep practicing medicine under the weight of a man who decided who lived clean and who didn't. The nurse called me 6 months after I left to say the clinic was filling in prescriptions per guidelines again and that people were coming to town in the light. It wasn't a tidy ending. It never is. But the notes stopped, the vandalism stopped, and the ledger that had once lived in the file drawer ended up under lock at the trooper's office. I kept the spreadsheets, the emails, the photos. They weren't trophies. They were a record of the slow, ugly way a small place can be controlled, and the better slow way people can untangle it when someone gets loud enough to matter. The morning the dog showed up half dead on the porch, I thought somebody had been cruel or careless. By the time the sirens finally came, I knew it was both. I was up early that week, clearing a path to the boat when old man Hope from the trapline came by with his coffee tin. He looked like he always did, sunburned face, hands that looked like they'd been in rope all his life, but he kept glancing at the tree line like he was watching something move. He told me kids were leaving food out for foxes again, and I laughed it off until he said the word most of us in town hate to hear, bait. People have always tried to feed wildlife out here. Kids toss bacon lying by the spruce, someone leaves a ham bone behind a shed. Usually it's crows and foxes and the occasional wolverine. But Hoke had seen traps set on the ridge, has of deer hanging off nails, and he said a couple of the hunters were using bait that smelled sweet and awful, spoiled meat and whatever they used to keep the dogs away. He said, lo and sure, that attracts more than foxes. I went home thinking about it. That afternoon my neighbor's Labrador, Gus, came staggering up the road with his fur matted and one ear raw or something had bitten him. Nobody knew whether to be angry or scared. The vet in town stapled the bite closed and warned us not to let dogs roam at night. He said the wound looked like a bite that came from a big dog, too big for a coyote. Small signs kept stacking up. Tracks, at first a single path of deep prints where the crust had been broken. Then a second trail alongside it, and the prints grew deeper and wider. A snowmobile driver reported seeing 6 shapes moving along the skyline at dusk, fast and low, heads down, and said it looked like wolves. Old-timers shrugged and said wolves pass through all the time, but the number and the timing didn't sit right. Wolves move. They don't usually hang on the edges unless something pulls them. We tried to talk to the hunters. The ones I knew flushed and mumbled, like you do when you get called out for something you don't want to own. The mayor, who knows everyone's business, told us to keep the peace and not make a fuss. Their feeding families and trapping has always been a thing, he said, but he didn't come with us to look at the bait piles. The piles themselves were easy to miss if you weren't looking. A tangle of canvas, a chunk of rotten moose, a smear of something bright at the center where the meat had been smeared with fat. When Amber's 5-year-old, Eli, didn't come home from preschool that afternoon, it was hours before anyone in town noticed because most of our routines are loose and people get absorbed into chores. We found his boot tracks leading away from the schoolyard into the brush, then stopping at one of the bait sites. The kid hadn't seen it as danger. He thought it was food. He thought maybe someone had left a snack. We called a search. Half the town turned out, flashlights and dogs and snow machines. We split into teams and pushed into the light. At first we found nothing, only farther tracks, wolf prints sweeping away from the bait and then gone. But then the dogs started acting wrong. Our lead dog, a husky named Bear, strained at his harness and flattened his ears until his whole body trembled. He kept looking over his shoulder, into the trees, and he wouldn't move forward. The pace at which things got worse surprised everyone. At dusk, while we were still calling Eli's name, a line of howling rose from the ridge, low and layered. It wasn't the lonely cry you'd expect from one animal calling in. It was a chorus, a reply along a corridor of trees, close enough that you heard fur brush snow. People went quiet like a blanket being dropped. That sound is used in folklore and in real life to mean something has marked the neighborhood. We tried to keep to the road for the most part after that, We put flares in an old metal barrel and lit them to mark the edge of town, sent a few men with rifles out in shifts. A wildlife officer flew in the next day and drove out with Hope to where the bait had been set. He walked around the piles and took pictures, then made a call on a satellite phone. He told us, flatly, that wolves had been drawn to the protein in the scent, that packs could form fast when food is concentrated, and that once they start feeding in the same spot they stop fearing people the way they used to. We thought we understood the problem, move the bait, remove the temptation, get the wolves to drift back to the wild. But there were two things we hadn't counted on. First, the poison. Someone had salted the meat with old insecticide, something cheap and brutal, intended to take out coyotes and keep the fur clean. That kills animals and makes other scavengers avoid the carcass, but it also makes wolves desperate and disoriented when the toxin doesn't kill them quickly. You could see it in their behavior. They were less careful, more likely to push into open places. Second, the pack was larger than anyone expected. A single breeding pair can gather cousins and aunts from a wide territory. The bait had been an anchor. On the third night, we lost the fence. It wasn't much, a low runoff fence around the community garden, but it was a boundary for the kids, and its posts were the first real defense. We walked down to check the garden and found the wire shredded, vegetables ruined, footprints leading through like a parade. The dogs we had on patrol refused to go near the fence. One of the guards swore he heard a low growl under the turf, as if something big was breathing. I remember that night walking the main road with the search lantern swinging from my hand, the light throwing shadows that leapt away from the tree line. We set motion lights and drove patrols with tractors, the beams sweeping across snow and into the dark. We banged pots and yelled to frighten anything off. People slept in shifts. Mothers stayed upstairs with kids in their beds. The radio chatter was sharp and thin, the kind that comes when a small town holds its breath. Late, when the world had thinned to me and the hiss of a distant engine, I heard something behind me moving through the snow. At first I thought it was a fox, then the crunching kept rhythm with a human step. I swung the beam around and saw eyes reflecting, orange, lined up along the ditch, 15 or 20 pairs, no space between them. They watched like someone in a fishing hole watches a bobber. It felt like a school of fish that had learned how to look at you. For a second my brain refused to fill the space with sense. Wolves, that many, that close, in the open. We lit more fires and fired a few rounds into the air. The blast scattered them like wind scatters birds. A few went into the trees, low and aggressive, and came back within minutes with a smugness in their stride that made everyone more nervous. We had no means to move a pack that large without risking the kids, and the state resources were hours away. The only helicopters were south, and snowstorms make timelines lie. Eli was found because he fell asleep in a low hollow under a windfall, curled inside his parka like a pocket. He woke when a grown hunter's voice called his name and came out, pale and shivering, but alive. The story should have ended there. Kid found, town relieved, but it didn't. The wolves had learned the perimeter. They were confident enough to take chances later that night when the wind masked human scent. The closest thing to a confrontation came when a small group of searchers tried to move a trail camera and got cornered on the base of the ridge. They were 3 men, 2 with rifles, 1 with only an axe because the rifle's bolt had frozen earlier. The wolves circled, a hem of dark moving along the trees. The dogs went berserk and then silent. The 3 men backed toward the snow machine and tried to get it started. It clogged and coughed. I remember the sound of one man calling, voice tight, and the wolf answering with a breath that wasn't an owl but a low, planning sound. For a terrifying minute it seemed like they would have to run through them. What saved them was noise and light and stupid luck. The searchers started the old machine with a choke and a push, and the engine kicked, the snow flew, and at the last second one of the wolves snapped, not at flesh but at the machine, and the pack split to chase. They drove the machine down the trail with wolves on their heels and people with guns firing over the hood, rounds popping like angry thunder. No one died. No one shot a wolf at point-blank range, The bullets were warning as much as defense. When they made it back to town, the men were shaking, mouths dry. They told us in the safety of the diner what it had looked like, teeth glinting, but also a flatness in the animals' eyes like hunger had made them bold. After that night, the men with the truck and the old .30-06 set up a rolling patrol. The wildlife officer finally got authority to shoot to protect life, and did so only when wolves charged real people. They scared a few away and wounded one who later slid into old snow and didn't get up. State traps were set with care and under supervision. The poison bait was traced to a young hunter who swore he only wanted to keep the coyotes off his traps and didn't mean the chain of things that followed. We lost some of our quiet. Families guarded their doors and held kids closer. We learned to stop feeding anything, not foxes, not ravens, nothing. The kid came back from the hospital with a blanket and a story about how the trees sounded when the wolves called, and how cold sleep can be. People kept that story close, like a map. We rebuilt the fence with heavier posts and wire, and put the garden under guard. The state hauled away the carcasses and paid fines, and a few hunters lost their licenses. It didn't fix everything. Some wolves moved on, some never did. The one we wounded turned up months later on the far side of a river, and a trapper's line passed quietly along a rumor and then a new rumor. The village didn't forget that winter. We slept with doors bolted and engines warm. I still walk past where the bait had been and see the grass flattened in a patch. It looks ordinary. But some nights, when the wind bends right and the moon is thin, I can hear the low chorus in the trees, and it makes my shoulders tighten. We were lucky, terrified and shaken, but lucky. A small community found itself on the wrong end of a mistake and lived to tell the way it sounds when a pack stops being something far away and becomes a thing that stands watching your porch light. I went to visit Josh because he said he had work in a place to stay for a few days up north. I'd heard of the town dry for 20 years, no license to sell, strict rules, but I'd never been. The road turned to gravel for the last 30-odd miles, then narrowed to a strip with houses clinging to the hill and a harbor that smelled of diesel and cod. People were polite, but there was a reserve to them, like everyone had agreed on a script and nothing outside that script was allowed. Josh greeted me at the end of his dock in a blue parka and a grin that didn't quite match his eyes. He'd been living there for a year, fixing nets, running odd jobs. He gave me his bunk and said his boss wouldn't care if I stayed a week. I noticed, that first evening, a steady flow of pickups coming down the road after dark, lights dimmed. Men dropped off crates at a shack behind the fish plant. They moved fast, quiet, like they didn't want to be seen. I asked a kid at a gas pump about it, and he shrugged like it was normal. People need stuff, he said. It didn't take long to see why the town tolerated it. The local store was a skeleton, no liquor license meant no profit from seasonal crowds, and the general pay for fishers and plant hands was thin. Josh worked sometimes for the man who ran the little trading post, a small business that kept the lights on until one of the trucks started bringing in pallets of something wrapped in brown paper. The trading post did fine when that happened. People who came in had a way of smiling like they owned half the shore when they walked out with a parcel under their coat. I wasn't naive. I knew bootlicking happened. But I didn't expect that when I asked Josh where those crates came from. He shrugged and said, down south, mostly. Sometimes flights. Sometimes boats. He added, offhand, cops look the other way. That stuck in my head, because cops looking the other way is different from people thinking the law is wrong. It was practical, like a bandage. The first unsettling thing was how everyone immediately knew when I asked questions that weren't small talk. Heads turned in the diner, forks stopped halfway to mouths, conversations slid away. People who'd been friendly for a bottle-faced greeting suddenly had their eyes on the sides of their heads. A woman at the co-op who'd given me directions the night before refused to look at me when I passed later. She muttered something, then closed the door. That kind of silence has weight. I ended up standing in the shed behind the fish plant at midnight because Josh wanted me there. He said he could use the muscle unloading a crate. It was cold in a way my jacket couldn't fix. When the truck came, 2 men hopped out, checked the road, and moved the crate into the shed with a drag that left scuff marks in the frost. The cardboard had nothing written on it. Josh popped it open and the smell struck me, the sweet, chemical tang of fermented spirits. He winked and said, "There you go. You can have one for the road." I could have laughed. I didn't. A week later, I realized I couldn't sleep around the place like an idiot. I take pictures for a living and I have a habit of recording things that seem ordinary until they aren't. I'd shot a few frames at the plant, then copied them to my laptop back at Josh's and kept scrolling until I saw the crate again, stacked in the back of the truck, men's faces half in shadow. There was a tail number on the trailer. I sent a brief note to an old contact, something off in a dry town. It felt like a small, stupid thing to do. Then the state troopers showed up. They came in and did what they do, quiet and official, papers, inventory, a plain seriousness that made people stop greeting each other like they had the flu. The truck drivers got led away for questioning, and 2 of the regulars who ran crates were taken up to the town office. Whatever evidence the troopers had came out of nowhere, and people were watching their livelihoods being checked off against the law. The trading post closed for a day while the investigators looked, and the town's undercurrent shifted like a tide. I didn't expect what happened next. The first note was folded and shoved under my bunk door at 3 in the morning. Stupid city ways. Go home. It was the kind you might toss and laugh at if you'd been raised on the city's blare, but on the 3rd night the note came with a smear of something rotten across it and the pillow on my bunk slashed right down the middle. The cot's mattress was wet and the thick smell of fish oil hit like a slap. I told Josh we should leave. He said to stay calm and he'd fix it. He went to the trading post by day and came home with a face like a man who swallowed something bitter. "They're mad," he said. "It's not just the lost stuff. It's pride. He runs the line." He pointed at no one in particular. I realized he meant the mayor, the old man who signs the town papers and keeps the machine of small favors oiled. Over the next days the things escalated in a tight, careful pattern. My truck's tires were flattened 2 mornings in a row, slashed like a safety pin through skin. Someone let a dog loose that had the habit of dragging tin cans tied to its collar down the road late at night. A woman left sugar on my doorstep that had been soaked in something no one wanted the kids to lick. A pair of young men followed me from the diner once, slow and patient, hands in their pockets, their jackets unbuttoned like they were daring me to take a swing. They didn't say anything. They didn't need to. Everyone in town recognized the rules. You don't push the boat that feeds you. You ask for what you need. You make space for the people who keep the motors running and the nets mended. I understood that in the abstract. I didn't understand the way people could turn their practical sense inward and make me, an outsider, into the problem. At church on Sunday, the pews were full and the pastor's sermon was about forgiveness and the warmth of community. People sat 2 chairs away from me. Someone whispered something and the kid handing out hymnals avoided my hand like it had a burn. After the service, the mayor stood in the doorway and looked at me long enough that my skin prickled. He nodded and the nod was small and empty. The town had decided something about me, and I'd given them the rope they needed. I tried to do the sensible thing. I called the trooper's number. The dispatcher said they keep an eye on things, but resources were thin and weather was going to shift. The troopers had to prioritize. I stayed at Josh's house for a week, then at a friend's spare shack down the coast, but the pressure followed. Notes kept arriving, folded, crisp, anonymous. Once a rock hit the kitchen window right next to my head at 2 in the morning, and I woke to see shadow move away behind the snow-dusted birch. My hand shook so badly filling a cup of coffee was an effort. The main confrontation came the week after the arrests. With men's pay interrupted and a business shuttered for inspection, people had mouths to feed and a quick thing to blame. It was easy to point at the outsider who had given the troopers the tail number on the trailer. They did it with the same tired anger they reserved for weather and fish and late planes. I woke to a pounding on the door and a voice bellowing. People outside the porch were shouting my name. They wanted me out. They wanted me to leave town and never return. Someone called me a thief for undermining the town's way of surviving. Another called me worse words, traitor, snitch. They had numbers. Their anger felt organized. I tried to speak, to say I had only tipped off an old friend who worked with enforcement, that I hadn't meant for anyone to lose a job. The mayor said, flat, people here feed each other. He didn't say it like he regretted it. He said it like a law. The crowd's voice didn't rise into violence. The way anger works there was more like a slow pressure, the kind that compels you to walk somewhere because everyone is walking. I saw a pair of men peel off and circle me, faces tight. One of them reached under his jacket and let his hand rest on a pistol, but where it showed, I felt my throat go dry. What saved me was a small, lumpy kindness from one person I thought indifferent. Old Hoke, the trapper who'd warned me about bait, came out from where he'd been watching. He put himself between me and the crowd and said, "He's a guest." He didn't yell. He didn't wave a finger. He said it like a fact that needed no arguing. That was enough to fracture the rhythm the mob had. Not everyone left, but the shove turned into a simmer. People muttered. Someone spat at the frost. A kid cried. I walked to my truck on legs that felt borrowed and left town before the light fell. I drove until the gravel turned to pavement and the radio station came back in steady. I called the troopers from the highway and told them I was leaving. They asked me to meet them at the next airfield and I agreed. Back in the city I found a cheap motel and slept with a closet light on because it made the room feel ordinary again. I filed what I had, photos, messages, notes, with the agency that handled contraband. They opened a case. Months later the trading post reopened with new management. I heard that some of the men who ran crates moved on, quietly, like fishermen leaving for another port. Josh kept in touch for a while and then he would answer once, then not at all. He said once on the phone that the town had a way of cleaning itself, not by law but by choosing who mattered. I asked if he was safe. He told me to mind the road. I don't say I was a hero. I was a man who thought the law mattered more than a closed economy, and because of it people I'd met learned how quickly a quiet life could turn on a single decision. I survived, which was the point, but the small ways the town tried to make me leave stuck with me. The sound of footsteps that didn't belong to anyone I knew, the polite faces that turned away, the slow stacking of threats until leaving was the simplest answer. I kept the photos on a backup drive. Sometimes I open them, mostly because looking at a picture of that brown-wrapped crate is the last honest thing I have from that place. I did a lot of stupid travel before I learned how boring and safe most of it was. This ferry ride should have been boring. I was going from Haines to Juneau, overnight, small cabin, the usual low-budget thing where you wake up in a different town and a ferry smells like diesel for the next day. I was tired from the drive up, wanted a bed, and that was it. The ship creaked and hummed like a thing that had been doing this for too long. People were in the mess hall eating chowder and complaining about the weather. The crew did their announcements in that flat, polite voice that makes everything feel routine. Life jackets under your seat, quiet hours after midnight, please respect other passengers. I remember thinking then that the privacy of a cabin on a ferry is mostly a courtesy. The door's locked from the inside but there's always a master key, and the corridors are louder than a hotel hallway. I booked one of the small inside cabins with a bunk and a little porthole you could barely see through. I dumped my bag, watched the shoreline slide away, had a beer at the bar, then brushed my teeth and went to bed. Late enough that the only thing besides the engine was the low thud of people walking the hall or the occasional laugh that slid down the stairwell and died. I woke once in the night to a noise like someone shifting a chair, thought nothing of it, then back to sleep. In the morning the cabin seemed fine. I made coffee at the tiny kettle, pulled on jeans, packed, and only halfway down the last sock did I notice a wet ring on the pillow. It was faint, but there. I assumed I drooled, sleep does weird stuff, but then I found the toothpaste cap off and under the bunk, a wrapper from a granola bar that I was sure I'd put in my pocket the night before, now crumpled on the floor. Small things, stupid easy to forget, the kind of stuff that looks like absent-mindedness until you stack them up. I told myself I'd been messy, that maybe I'd dropped the wrapper and not remembered. That's the first trick your head plays, trading worry for something sensible so you can get on with the day. We left the ship for a few hours at the next stop. I went out, got coffee, walked the dock. When I came back, the bunk had an extra towel folded on it. A clean towel, the kind the ferry provides by the door, but it wasn't one of mine, and it wasn't there when I left. I checked the door lock and the little latch inside, both set like I'd left them. I snapped a photo because I am the sort of person who takes photos of stupid things, and because that's how my brain buys time. If I had evidence it was a problem, I thought, I wouldn't be making it up to myself. That afternoon I texted a friend and mentioned it. He said not to worry, people leave towels, weird stuff happens. He suggested I call the desk if anything else happened. I admired the simplicity of that until night fell and the sheltering hum of the ferry fell thin. The second night I woke at the sound of hinges. The cabin door clicked once like somebody was testing it, then a lower, softer sound, footsteps pressing almost soundlessly across linoleum. I stared at the dark ceiling until my eyes adjusted. The corridor light was on a dimmer. I could see the light stripe under the door. My first stupid thought was that the crew had come to check rooms. They do that sometimes. My second thought was that wasn't how it sounded. I lay very still and watched the door handle cast a long shadow. The footsteps stopped outside for a moment. Maybe 20 seconds. Then came a scratching, like someone rubbing fabric with their palm. The handle eased down a fraction. My heart did that quick animal thing where it skipped and then felt heavy. I had the phone in my hand because that's what you do now, light and camera and a small weapon all in one. I did something I'd never done before. Instead of flipping on the light and yelling, I pretended to sleep and let the recording app run in the dark. It felt like a small gamble. Catch it or scare it off and find out nothing. The door clicked. There was a soft rustle, the whisper of fabric, and then the inside knob moved. It never turned far enough to open. Maybe someone slid their hand beneath and felt for the latch. Maybe they tried the handle and it caught. The whole thing took under a minute and then the footsteps retreated. I sat up and watched until my hands stopped shaking. When I opened the door there was nothing in the hall but the regular passengers and the crew cart, and everyone looked like they had the right to be where they were. No one stared or ran. I went to the desk and asked in a voice that tried to be casual if housekeeping wanted to check my cabin. The woman at the desk smiled and said housekeeping doesn't come up after midnight unless requested. We can send someone now if you like, she said. I said yes. A guy showed up within 5 minutes, housekeeping. He had a lanyard and the polite blank face of someone who cleans the entire night. He asked why, and I said the door had been fiddled with and my things were out of place. He frowned like he had a procedure to follow, radioed the supervisor and promised to note it. He said he'd put a spare towel and hang my do not disturb sign. I watched him go down the hall, and when I followed later I noticed his cart had towels but also a small stack of paper cups that matched the one on my bedside table. I slept in the chair that night with the phone in my fist and the little light from the screen skinned over everything. At 3 I woke to a tug on the blanket and the soft bump of breath near my ear. I couldn't tell if it was my mind or the ship. Either way, I felt watched until dawn. When I checked the footage on my phone in the morning, only a few seconds of audio because I hadn't thought to leave it rolling. I could hear the handle jostle and quiet shoes back away. No face. No voice. The little sounds felt enormous. The ordinary rustles of life turned sharp and threatening because they happened to me. The staff at the desk looked apologetic the next day and offered me a different cabin further down the corridor. I said yes and moved everything. The second room was supposed to be safer. It was further from the stairwell and the corridor had a crew office at the end. The first night there I made the cabin look occupied, light on the small lamp, bag on the chair, the TV on. I left the lock set. I put the phone camera pointed at the door and propped it under a jacket. I told myself it was a dumb idea, but the only other option was to live with that little hollow mouth at the center of every night. At 2 in the morning, the phone buzzed with a notification and I smelled coffee, as if someone had bumped the kettle. I reached for the phone and the screen showed a shadow crossing under the door. I grabbed the jacket and lifted the camera and saw, clear as a bad joke, a pair of sneakers in the frame and a sleeve of a jacket with the ferry logo. It was someone in uniform. I flung the door open and saw a crewman with a cart frozen at the end of the hall. He had a rag in his hand and the expression of someone embarrassed to have been seen doing something that could be explained. He muttered something about checking a leak and pushed the cart away. I grabbed him by the arm and asked him why he'd been in my cabin. He said he'd been checking an odor on deck and must have mistaken my cabin for another. It was rinse and repeat nonsense. My voice was hoarse. He kept looking at the open camera on my phone like it was the thing that would convict him. I went to the desk again and this time the supervisor came out. I played the clip on my phone and showed the man in uniform. He watched, lips tight. The supervisor said they take safety very seriously and asked for the crewman's name. He said the man was from housekeeping. They checked his log and called security. There was a talk with the man in the office. Later they told me the man admitted he'd been making rounds to check for leaks and that the master key was not supposed to be used for rooms unless requested. They took his cart and said he'd be reassigned. They searched other cabins while the ship steamed and found stuff in a couple of other rooms, too many little things that belonged to different people tucked under beds or in linen bags, a pair of earbuds with someone else's brand, a bracelet that had been reported missing. The chief mate came and apologized in a voice that sounded like he was clearing away something sticky. He said the ship's loss prevention would file a report when we docked and that if anything was missing they would make sure police had it. He gave me a voucher for the next trip and said they'd press charges if the evidence held. At the next port, a security officer came aboard and interviewed me by the gangway. They took the video off my phone and asked me to describe missing items. The crewman was politely escorted off at that dock, his cart emptied and his uniform flagged. I watched him go, his shoulders not slumped but carrying the small professional weight of a man who knows he belongs to a system that will judge. People told me to be careful about accusing staff. Mistakes happen, wires cross. They were right, but there was a look in the eyes of the other passengers when the news got out, that small, private relief that the thing worrying them wasn't just their own. I got my stuff back. 2 small things that had been moved were returned from lost and found with notes of apology from a crew supervisor. The ferry company took the report seriously enough to change procedure. Keys kept closer, extra checks on who had access, cameras moved on the corridor for the remaining legs. The crewman was replaced in my cabin rotation. I don't tell the story to make the ship look bad. These ferries are how a lot of people get where they need to go. But there are times when small, repeating things, forgotten wrappers, towels in odd places, a handle jostled are the clue that someone is slipping the private line of your life. The end was ordinary, a form, a refund, an embarrassed man taken off at the next port. I left in the dawn with my backpack heavier because I had put a lock on the bag, and when I rolled my suitcase down the pier I kept looking back as if the last step might matter. I knew enough to hang my food. I'd done enough trips in the Alaska backcountry to know that a bear with a belly full of people's garbage is a disaster you don't want to meet. Still, the way the cache looked that first morning felt like being punched in the ribs. I had tied my bag up in a creaking willow, where the small river bend made a little island and the tree stood taller than the marsh around it. I strangled the slack with half a dozen knots and tossed the pack high, then cinched a rope over a limb and wedged a stick so it wouldn't slide. Easy, stupid secure. I'd even smiled when I climbed into my tarp shelter and thought, I'll get up at dawn, have coffee, and be on the trail by 8. I woke to bright, cold light and a silence that wasn't normal. The small birds weren't in the brush. The river sounded far away, though it was a few feet away. I sat up and saw the rope was slack and the end of it lay frayed on the ground. The pack was gone. My stomach contracted. I ran out and stared at the torn twine, at shreds of nylon hanging in the willow like bad teeth, at the smear of something dark on the bark and a long, coarse hair snagged on the stick. Bear hair. Big hairs, like a man's fingers through them. There was a gouge in the mud where something heavy had turned. I wasn't new enough to panic. I checked the tarp, counted what I had, a small stove, a cook pot with about half a gas canister, a roll of jerky, 2 energy bars. My water bladder had a hairline tear. The bear had eaten the rest. The map showed a road 20, maybe 40 miles from where I was, downriver and then a left through a burn I knew. I thought I had 3 days' food for a weekend loop. Suddenly I had to go 40 miles with maybe a liter of water and a half can of fuel. It was stupid and obvious at once. The river led downstream to people. People led to gas and food and phone service. I shoved the panic down because panic makes mistakes. I packed what I had, wrapped the stove in a shirt, and slid the remaining jerky into a pocket under my jacket. I walked slowly back to the willow and looked for tracks. Deep, widely spaced, round depressions led off toward the spruce. Once you see the size of the pads, you stop asking whether it's a bear. I followed a line of prints for a few yards, and they cut into the willows like someone walking a dog and then vanished under the brush. That was the first quiet thing that felt wrong. The bear hadn't run off. It had disappeared like a thing that planned to be around. I set off downstream because water goes to people and people to roads. The river made the route mostly straightforward. Follow a channel, cross only where logs lay, and you don't have to trust your compass when you can see the current. The first mile was fine. My pack felt light, which made my steps quicker than they should have been. I kept my head on a swivel, listening for the small background sounds, a twig snap, the subtle scrape of something heavy in the brush. By mid-afternoon I had the worst of the day behind me, but not the worst of the worry. The sky was clear, but the wind cut through the alders, and I had the constant, hollow sense of eyes on me. Once, I heard a low-hanging sound and turned hard enough to make my neck ache. A big brown shoulder moved through a thicket maybe 200 yards away, then the trees swallowed it. I didn't call. Bears are curious, and the noise of your voice can do worse than nothing. Sometimes it brings them close to see what you are. I kept walking. At some point I realized I was being followed in a way that wasn't random. Tracks paralleled the river, one set, then mine, then another set, always a little behind. They crossed my path and then came back and then crossed again. The spacing and the number of claw marks said more than one bear, and the way the tracks circled told me they were watching my route rather than just passing through. That night I slept in the lee of a rock outcrop because I didn't want the smell of my small meal under the tarp to hang where a bear could smell it and know where I'd be. I cooked the jerky in a half cup of rice and ate it in a small bowl, then filled my bottle from the river and drank only a little. Wind and the slow creak of poplar leaves were the soundtrack. Around midnight something came very close. Not the brush snap close you get with deer, close enough that I could hear heavy breathing and a wet, patient sniffing. I balanced the headlamp on my knee and clicked it on, light sweeping the dark. A bear's face looked up out of the blackness maybe 8 feet away, dark as a coal and big as a barrel. Its nose glistened. The animal didn't run. It just tilted its head and sniffed the air like someone reading a menu. My hand shook so badly the flashlight bobbed. I didn't move fast. I didn't shout. I made a careful sound with my throat and clapped my hands, slow and deliberate, and the bear took a step back. Then it sniffed again and sat down and watched. Watching, not running away. Watching like it had a chart and I hadn't noticed. I had spray in my pocket, 1 canister. I'd been saving it for a bad day. That night I put it in my hand like a lifeline. When the bear stood and came toward me the second time, bigger and a little more interested, I let a line of pepper burst out in its direction. The spray made a sound like someone opening a can of wind. The bear stopped, reared up for a half second like it was shocked, and then turned and lumbered away. I could hear it chewing something off the bank, the crunch of bone and bark. It didn't charge again, but the next day the tracks were closer. The stalking wasn't constant. Sometimes hours would pass with only the river and crows and the distant hum of a plane. Other times the noise came in that tight rhythm, branches snapping, rocks rolled, a big silhouette crossing the crest of a small ridge and halting to look down where I was. The anger I expected didn't show. The bears were patient. They followed, they tested, they circled and waited to see if I made a mistake. I hiked by day and rested in short bursts. My feet blistered because I hadn't expected to do 40 miles on trails that turned into alder slurry and then into swampy muskeg. The map lied in spots and the compass needed adjustments. One time I had to bushwhack 500 yards through willows that grabbed at my sleeves and throttled my progress. And when I came out onto a beach gravel bar, the track that had been behind me was suddenly where I'd walked through the willows, like someone had been behind me the entire time and used the thinning to step out and watch. Sleep was short and shallow. I found a few berry patches and ate until my stomach felt like it might turn, because calories now were as valuable as clean water. By the third day my left knee ached and the blister under my big toe had burst. My energy was a kind of steady, boring pain. The bears were still there, sometimes silent and sometimes vocal, the long, low moans of a pack that had learned something about people, where they leave food, how they move, how they fuss and then leave. The main confrontation happened 2 hours before dusk on the last day. I was crossing an old logging road and hoped for a truck, a passerby, anything real. Instead I saw a line of bodies on the rise to my left. A sow with 2 yearling cubs posed like a small, slow army. They hadn't seen me yet. For a second I thought about running, which is always wrong. I crouched down, put my pack between me and them, and took inventory. My spray, my lighter which I used to make a sudden flare, the small folding saw that will not scare off a bear but might make a noise. They turned their heads to the road as if a scent told them a change. The cubs came forward first, curious, prancing in that imbecile way all young animals have, and the mother watched. She did not huff or charge. She watched and calculated. I appealed to whatever worked: noise, light, being very big and ugly. I fired a flare in a wide arc and screamed like a fool. It might have been the flare or the sound or both, but the cubs ducked and the sow stepped back. For 10 seconds that felt very long she balanced between fight and flight, then decided I was trouble and not supper and pivoted up the slope, the cubs scrambling behind her. I didn't celebrate. I kept walking for an hour after that, my hands still high, my voice used up. Then at the far end of the logging road a truck sat, diesel black, driver asleep. I banged on the door until the man woke and glanced at me like I was part of a bad dream. I muttered the name of the nearest town, said food and bear until he understood, and he made me climb in. We drove back along the road that would have been my nightmare if I'd had to walk it at night. He dropped me at a ranger station where the woman on duty fed me warm soup and took my statement. They sent a crew back with a truck to check the caching site and mark the area with signs. I wasn't equipped to fight a bear, and I didn't want to be. I got patched, given a ration pack, and a ride out. The bear stayed in the willows, and the news told the story of a man who almost trusted himself out there, which was true and only half the story. The rest is the slow part, the hours that taught me how close a big animal will let you get if it decides to study you, the tiny things you notice when you think you're alone, the way your throat keeps tasting river water for days after you get home. I was supposed to be on a short recon, not a story. I'd taken a long weekend to hike a line of ridges east of the highway, nothing fancy, just a route I'd been curious about. The map showed old placer claims, but most of those were ghost things. You expect a rusted wheel or a sagging cabin if you find anything at all. The plan was simple: get away for a couple days, take pictures, find a place to read a map by a small fire. The first odd thing I noticed was the road. Where the trail usually narrowed into 2 tracks through spruce, someone had widened it with a grader recently enough that the fresh gravel still sat loose. I stepped off the berm and my boots sank an inch into material that had the sheen of dusted mica. I heard a distant thump, the awful, steady beat of an engine, like a heart you weren't meant to hear in a place like that. I told myself it could be a logging crew, or the road maintenance truck, or someone dragging a boat. Nothing is shocking in Alaska until it is. I pushed on. The smell came next, diesel and boiled oil, sharp and clean on cold air. That smell is honest in a way birdsong isn't. It told me people were nearby. Half a mile and I found the sluice boxes. They were built into a swale beside the creek, clean lines of aluminum stacked like ribs, slick with black sand. There was a pump, a portable unit on skids, sucking water and spitting it down a hose. The water below ran chocolate brown and full of a weird, oily film. A line of plastic drums sat stacked by the bank, lids scored and stained. A small generator hummed behind a tarp with a cadence that made my teeth ache. There were other signs, even before I saw anyone: a 4x4 track in soft ground, cigarette butts melted into the gravel like tiny, ugly monuments, a boot print half a size too big for the usual hiker. Birds that usually peeped at the creek were silent. I took pictures because that's what I do, because you want evidence, and because taking pictures is a way to slow your breathing and pretend you're a scientist instead of a guy who just walked into someone's wrong. I circled the sluice to see how complete it was. Men had hammered timbers to make a short dock. There was a plywood shack with a propane heater vent, a dog chained to a stump that watched me with the distant, flat look of a dog who has learned not to move unless told. The dog didn't bark immediately. It just watched my boots like it might learn my future. I had my pack on when I heard the first clear human voice, not a shout, just a low talk. 2 men stepped out from behind a berm, rifles slung, the sort of long-barreled hunting rifles you see in photos of bush life. One wore a bright orange vest, the other had a face sun-aged and laced with a scar on the cheek. Their hands were steady on the barrels. They were not in the mood to be curious. "Hey," the orange vest said. It wasn't a friendly hey, it was the pronunciation you use when you mean someone to stop immediately. I froze because that is what you do when the thing you came for is in a live situation. I had a camera bag, a water bottle, and a stupid amount of daylight left. I told them, quick and flat, that I was hiking the ridge, a day trip, wrong turn. It sounded mechanical in my mouth. It slid into the cold air. That, more than anything, made the foreground go very thin. The scar-faced man squinted at my pack, at the muddy hem of my trousers. "You're pretty close," he said. He had a way of saying it that included numbers and consequences. They didn't move their guns, but their fingers sat near them like they were weights ready to drop. I offered to back out the way I'd come. "I took the spur," I said. "I'm heading back, no problem." They looked at each other. The one with the orange vest took half a step forward and then, like a slow taut chord, his hand came up to his radio. My chest nodded because radios mean coordination and coordination means plans you aren't part of. There was a low mutter and his other hand went to his belt, where a pistol hung in a leather holster. I hadn't expected a pistol. You make little mistakes in the wilderness all the time, but this looked like a place where mistakes were a problem someone had already solved. You can turn around now, the scar-faced man said. You post up for the night? He was answering a question I hadn't asked. No, I said. I'll leave. Now. It's stupid how loud your own breathing sounds in those minutes. I backed away with my hands, because people like hands when guns are around, held up so they could see them. I didn't move too fast. They watched my pack like they knew what was in it, like it might be evidence. The chained dog lifted its head and let out a single, bored-sounding bark. The owner, who'd been silent until then, muttered and walked toward the shack. I thought it would end clean, me walking back, them watching, a story where the dangerous thing is just proximity. I made the first 3 steps and then a boot struck a log behind me. A man's shout ran along the bank and I saw, out of the corner of my eye, a second group rounding the river bend, 3 men, one hefting a rifle with a scope. They weren't waving. They were looking at me like something had crept into their calculations. One of them raised a hand and pointed downriver, in the direction of the logging road I'd come from. You go that way, he said. You run, we'll shoot. There it was. Not a negotiation. An instruction. I looked at their faces, at the cold set of their jaws, and I measured that they were willing to back a threat with steel. I had no cell service, no obvious path for help, and nothing but the camera gear and a small knife in a boot sheath. My boots felt like someone else's. I told them I hadn't meant to get in the way, that I would leave quietly. I'll go that way, okay? I said, pointing up the ridge in the other direction. My voice was small and not confident. The man with the scope made a noise that might have been a laugh. The scar-faced man said, "There's no route that way. You keep going off the wrong maps, city boy." The word city boy should have stung more than it did. What mattered was the gap between me and the truck track and the river and the people who had already decided I was a problem. The orange vest flicked his radio like a switch, and someone in the shack yelled for dogs. The air got heavier with intent. I had 2 practical choices in the fog of that moment: run for a place they weren't watching and hope the dogs or the rifles missed me, or stall them long enough to pick a route that didn't involve giving them the theater of my panic. I chose stalling and prying and moving like someone who'd been born to find the smallest options. You want me to sign something? I asked. I had no idea what signing does, but it sounded like a bridge. Shockingly, it worked for a beat. The scar-faced man considered it long enough that his braid of impatience hung loose. Sign what? He asked. Anything. I'll sign I was wrong, I said. I'll say I trespassed. I'll not report. Whatever. Silence. Then the orange vest's shoulders dropped a fraction like a hand had eased off his spine. He held up a heavy notebook and a pen like it was a talisman. You sign, he said. Then you go. You don't take pictures. You don't tell. He spoke like someone stating bookkeeping. I signed. It was the stupidest, most humiliating thing I've done in the outdoors. My name, date, a line that read I trespassed and would not report, written with a hand that shook because men with rifles had written their terms in the margins. The scar-faced man watched like he wanted to memorize my way of forming letters. They let me go because that's what they did. They wanted to remove a witness without making a spectacle. They watched me twist away with my pack and walk. They didn't follow at first. They had other work, the pumps, the sloughs, keeping the line moving. Their politics are often a combination of greed and logistics. But I knew they could watch, and they did. The second group sat up on a rise where I had to walk by them, the rifled man's scope resting across his knees. The dog on the bank tilted its head like it was counting the beats of my heart. I moved faster than I thought I could in wet boots and thigh-high brush. My ribs burned. At one point a man in a camouflage jacket stepped out from between willows and blocked the way, and I froze because all the training about not looking surprised is useless when a human is close enough to hand you an actual breath. He didn't raise his rifle. He just looked like he wanted to see if I kept my promise. I nodded, uselessly. He let me pass. Out on the logging road I ran until my lungs hated me. I didn't stop until I reached my truck where, in a moment that should have been comic, a squirrel knocked a radio antenna and made me laugh in a way that startled me into being alive. I drove without headlights until I hit the highway and found a DOT pullout where I could get a bar or two of cell. The call I made was the whole point of the stupid, small signature. I called state troopers, then the Forest Service, and I told them the name of the creek and the time. They asked me to wait. They asked me to relive every step. I sat on the tailgate, my hands still trembling like I'd been holding something too hot. They came later, slower than I wanted, but sooner than I'd feared. A forest ranger rolled up in gumboots and a state trooper came in a truck with proper lights. We drove back to the sluice. The men had left by then, but the damage was a thing you can point to. Black water, a flattened bank where pumps had sucked the creek low, empty drums laying in a line like a careless barcode. There were prints where I'd signed and ragged boot marks where they'd walked. The dog was gone. They took my statement, my photos, and filled out the paper. They radioed for a game warden and a criminal investigator. I learned afterward that those operations are messy to break up jurisdictional knots and the reality that men with gear can pack up quick when someone comes with a badge. They tracked the tail numbers from the truck photos and tied them into other tip-offs. Months later there were arrests. Some of the equipment turned up in a yard 3 valleys over. I left that creek with a notebook ache in my shoulder and gravel in my boots. I didn't go back. I had signed a sheet of paper to save my skin, and later I gave a sworn statement in a warm room with coffee and fluorescent lights. That paper, the sign and don't tell note, didn't matter the way I thought it would. The story mattered more than the forced ink. The men who watched still exist. Men like that are always a part of places where the law is thin. What kept me alive was not courage or wit, but a stupid, stubborn chain of small choices. Not running, talking, signing, and then getting help as soon as I could. We were coming down through a bank of cloud when the engine shuddered and the world narrowed to a single bright noise. The pilot kept his voice steady, brace, brace, but there wasn't time to be afraid in any big, cinematic way. The little charter hit like a thrown sack and slid, then stopped on a sheet of ice with the prop tips still warm and steam from the tail fanning into the cold. I remember the small details first, the smell of hot upholstery and the pilot swearing under his breath, the thin, precise chime of the ELT trying to talk but coming up with nothing but a flat hiss. Our radios were dead from the start, something fried when the spinner bit the ice. No one knew at first how long we'd been in the airplane's window. The pilot figured we'd gone well off our planned route. The GPS on his handheld showed mountains like a blocky painting and a dot that read nowhere. People reacted like people. A man with a bad shoulder cursed because he couldn't get out the emergency exit without help. An older woman sat very still and kept whispering to herself. We had jackets, some food, a few flares, a single small stove that the pilot practically inhaled when he saw it. Outside, the lake was white and hard and the sky was a pale thin blue. We made a shelter out of wreckage and canvas. We burned the remaining fuel in the cook pot when the pilot said the metal smell would keep things from freezing too fast. Nights were worse than the daylight in a way I wasn't prepared for. The radio stayed a dead mouth. The ELT chirped when you walked past it, like a small insect trapped in the fuselage. We tried waving the emergency mirror. There were no planes on the horizon. We figured the flight plan would trigger a search eventually. Someone would notice we didn't land, but the idea of waiting felt stupid and dangerous, like hoping was a plan. The first night, we heard them. Not wolves howling, not animals, snowmobile noise, far off, then closer, then oddly patient. Engines on a frozen lake have a particular dry tone. You hear them and your skin tightens. We saw lights at first as 2 pinpricks and then a line of 3, sliding along the far shore, not approaching recklessly but making a slow pass as if trying to catalog us. In the morning there were tracks. Heavy ski lines and boot prints that led along the shoreline and then stopped as if the people had crouched and watched. At the wreck, people tried to be rational. The pilot said scavengers might come, locals, he called them, but his face tightened around the word like it didn't fit. Someone in a place like that takes risk like a profession. The pilot's guess was practical. Salvage, guns, radios, anything that might be valuable or useful. We were on other people's terrain and people's needs press a certain way. I noticed the little things, cigarette butts crushed in the drift 100 yards away, the faint smell of 2-stroke oil drifting over the ice, footprints that were too big to be us. The dog prints mixed with boots. We saw a small pile of canned food 100 yards away, as if someone had left a trap to see who would show up. We tried to make ourselves dull. We hid what we could, piled wreckage over the most obvious things, and kept 2 people awake a shift to watch. You learn fast what the cold lets you do. Your fingers stop flying. You learn to move big and slow so you don't waste heat. And you learn to take tiny pleasures, hot tea like it's a feast, someone's wool cap that smells like home. The nights lengthened. The far lights would creep closer like a thought. A man came out of the low ridge on the 3rd night. He didn't shout, he didn't wave his arms. He stood with a headlamp off like a silhouette and watched us, hands in his pockets. 2 others materialized behind him, and one of them had a rifle leaned on his shoulder the wrong way, casual, comfortable. When he spoke, he sounded like he belonged to the place, as if his cold had fused to him the way our cold had become part of our bones. "You folks okay?" he called, voice carrying. It was the simplest question and the sharpest at the same time. You could tell from how he walked that he wasn't there to help. He wanted to name what we were to him. Possible trouble, possible salvage, possible story. We said yes because you say yes when you mean no, and because lying in that moment felt like a provocation. His light skimmed the wreck like a hand. He asked about the radios and the pilot said broken. The man's face didn't change. "You need fuel?" "We got spare," he offered in that casual way of people who trade goods for favors. Behind him his partner laughed once, the kind of laugh that lets you know they discuss 1,000 options for how to make money that day. We made the right small choices at first. We kept our distance and our faces bland. The pilot, who'd been flying in that country for 20 years, sat up straight and performed a series of gestures. "No, please leave it. We can sign over salvage later," which read as diplomatic as possible for a man who just landed upside down on a lake. The man with the rifle looked at him like he was choosing whether to believe we were stupid or dangerous. He didn't decide either way. That night they circled closer. You can feel people watching in the same way you feel wind change, a pressure, a shift. They left little markers, twigs glued upright in the snow, a boot print turned deliberately to face the plains so we would know they had been near and seen us. At some point a can of soup was gone from our cache and a small notebook the pilot kept for routes was missing. They weren't trying to frighten us that first week, they were probing like an animal pushes at a fence. On the 4th night the man with the rifle came close enough that I could hear the breath in his nose. He spoke without showing teeth. "You should tell us what you got, so we can do right by you," he said, casual. It was a sentence with a knife in it. The pilot held up his hands and offered the salvage plan he'd been debating in his head for 2 nights. I thought that would appease them. It didn't. The man didn't respond with law or help. He gave us terms and a tone. We would leave valuables, we'd be left to the cold, or they would help themselves. The threat is not always the raised gun. Sometimes it's the precise calm of a man assuming he will be obeyed. The pilot signed something in the snow with a stub of pencil, a stupid gesture. It didn't seem to matter. What saved us was small and sharp and slow. One of the passengers, a woman with a hunter's steadiness, decided she had had enough of being negotiated. Late that night, when the men withdrew to their machines, she took the Rex flares and a piece of mirror and walked 60 yards along the ice to a small rise. She waited until the moon threw a thin silver, and then she flashed until her arm burned. Flare after flare and mirror flash after mirror. The men saw her and laughed, then their laughter slid into something quieter when they looked up and found a dot, no, 2 dots faint at the horizon. You can make a small signal across a flat white empty land a big thing. Flares smoke, mirrors wink in a way that tells pilots there's a life down there that wants to be found. It took hours and a numb arm and a mouth tasting of metal for her to get a plane to notice. A thin whine at first, then a bigger sound, then a hovering shadow that made the men on the shoreline turn and run like they had a hand to protect. When the helicopter came in over the wreck, everything changed. The men with guns retreated. They had no desire to confront a machine that could lift things and people and attention. We watched them duck behind a berm and melt back into the spruce. The pilot wept like a quick, small thing right there in the snow. We packed what we could. The survivors climbed into the chopper with our packs and a stove and a lot of cold. They took our statements later, in a warm building where the coffee was the first honest thing all day. The men on the lake became a case file, a rumor with a name. The authorities said they tracked the machines back through their registrations, that they had notes about salvage crews, about the thin line between subsistence and theft in backcountry lakes. The helicopter pilot called it a good signal, said the woman's mirror and the flares had bought us a small urgency. We left the wreck behind. The sled tracks dried in the sun and the snow under the wings grew crusted and blue. I still think of the precise way the men watched us, how ordinary they were: jeans, parkas, hands that had always made rules bend. They weren't monsters. They were people who had learned how to take advantage of a bad situation. That's the part that kept me awake longer than the cold did, how easily a person can be persuaded to look at another as salvage, and how small things, an extra flare, a mirror, a stretched arm, become your whole plan for not being taken. We were 3 weeks into a 6-week hitch when the real danger didn't come from a storm or a leak or anything mechanical. It started like most bad things do on an oil platform, with small annoyances that you put down as part of the job. I was a floor hand on the Axton spar, 12-hour swing shifts, boots that never quite dried, and a bunk that smelled faintly of things you couldn't air out. The crew was maybe 30 guys, rotation from all over: roustabouts, crane operators, a medic, the usual. Supply ship was due in 5 days. We always counted supply days. They meant fresh boots, mail, a bar of soap that wasn't from the machine. Helicopter runs were iffy in late October. Weather pencils were more like suggestions. The odd things started 2 nights after a newbie, Nate, came up on deck. Nate was quiet, which in our world can mean careful or trouble in waiting. He'd been hired through one of the local yards, had the right certificates and the wrong instinct for hush. He stayed late that night bolting down a hatch after the guys left for chow. I saw him walk across the moonlit deck toward the maintenance area, then heard a shout, a crash like someone hit a ladder. I shrugged and kept on. Noise is noise on a rig. Next morning Nate didn't show for muster. He was dormed out of sight, and we thought maybe he'd taken a day wrong side. Later that day the tool pusher asked who'd been in the lower pump room last night. Nobody owned it. The medic checked off his logs and said Nate had signed in for second shift the previous evening. It was just paperwork until a maintenance tech found a spread of blood near the blower housing, not a lot, but enough for people to look up from their tasks and stop. The medic closed the area and said it was probably from a cut and he patched it. We all went back to work. I saw Nate that night. He came out of the stairwell with his shirt loose and a black smear on his cuff. He avoided eye contact, walked like someone who had practiced how not to be noticed. When I asked if he was okay, he muttered something about a slip on the ladder and went upstairs. People talked in quiet circles after that, the way we do on rotation theories, rumors. He probably got pinched on a valve, someone said. Guys get banged up all the time. Fine. We finished the shift and forgot it as the deck hummed and pumps coughed and we bunched socks to dry. 2 days later there was actual trouble. I was on the night watch doing a routine walkthrough by the Sheen pit when I heard voices, not the loose laughing of the day, but a short, sharp argument, like two people with two ideas about the same dangerous thing. I moved closer because that's what you do, curious and stupid, all at once. The argument spilled out from the compressor alley, Nate and one of the guys from logistics, a foreman named Harlan. Harlan was the kind of man the rig listens to, a square-shouldered guy with a habit of telling rules like facts. I didn't know what it was about, only that the tone had gotten flat and urgent, and then, in 1 second at geometric, everything snapped into motion. Nate shoved Harlan, not hard at first, but Harlan shoved back in a way that made the rail clank. I stepped in because people step in, and then there was an accidental trip, a hand on a pipe, a sudden wet noise, and Nate hit the catwalk edge and slid down into the maintenance pit. He didn't get up. For a second, everything slowed in that way it does in accidents, the way your brain catalogs tiny details to make sense of the sequence. Harlan looked down. His face went blank. He crouched and checked Nate, and then the blank turned to a quick, efficient motion. He jabbed a roll of gauze into the other's mouth, shoved the ladder over, and shouted for help like someone who had to force the scene into a story. He must have been drunk, Harlan said. He fell before I could reach him. The medic ran and said he'd call medevac, the usual emergency cadence. We all ran our parts. Nate was dead before the chopper could get us off. The pilot said there was blunt force trauma. The medevac crew said he hit his head on the pump housing. Harlan sat on a steel box, hands white, repeating accident like a prayer, and the company men took notes. The official line rolled in the next day. Tragic incident, internal investigation, full cooperation. We signed some statements and went back to work. This is where the thing turns slow and mean. On the rig, nothing actually moves quickly. Bad things get papered over with procedure because when a platform is shut for an incident, people lose pay and the company loses millions. There's a tendency, I don't know whether it's greed or fear, to steer the story toward the easiest bottom line. People fall, people get hurt. Management didn't outright lie to us. They framed the event like a happening that had no human intention behind it. I didn't believe that part. Maybe because I'd seen Harlan's hands when Nate fell. They weren't shaking. Maybe because Nate had been careful in his week on deck. Maybe because the med kit the medic used looked like it had been used to slow, not to do for the emergency. Whatever reason, I started watching. Watching on a rig is a hard thing to do without being obvious. Everyone's on shifts. People disappear into the galley, the engine room, the permit to work forms. Harlan kept his routine like a man with a script. But little things changed. My boots were scuffed in a pattern from the pump room after I'd polished them. My locker was nudged once. My hard hat was on the bottom shelf when I'd left it on top. Someone left a note on my locker, anonymous, half-sassed, "Keep your head down." The note felt like a small hand on the back of my neck. I told the medic, quietly, and he shrugged and said we couldn't go against the formal investigation. "File it in the system," he said. Let the forensics do their job. I put the note in my pocket. That night I found my camera in a Pelican case, unzipped and with an SD card missing. The camera had been where I'd left it. The card had the photos I'd taken the night of the argument, grainy, yes, but enough to show Harlan's posture, the shove, the look on his face. Someone had taken the card. From then on, Harlan's shadow felt longer. He started appearing in places like he already knew I might be. A tool vanished from my locker. A welding hood was left on the catwalk above my sleeping walkway. Once, late, while I was topping off my drink, someone tapped the screen of my bunk with a gloved finger. No note that time, just a precise mark like someone had wanted me to know they had been there while I slept. You can't file a criminal complaint from a bunk side or a galley. You can call the Marine office, but calls shuttle through a chain, superintendent, company, Coast Guard. The supply ship was due to come in 3 days, and once it landed, company security and the Coast Guard usually walk the deck and take statements. That ship was the only real arrival I counted on. Until then, I was stuck with Harlan and his quiet motions. So I made small plans. I kept an eye on Harlan and wrote everything in a little notebook I hid under a false floor in my locker. I memorized who came and went from the pump room and when. I started carrying my camera with a strap wound under my jacket so the card couldn't be pulled. I told a couple of the guys who were friends that I thought Need's fall had been a shove. One of them, Marco, laughed and then didn't. He had the look of a man with too many responsibilities. "You sure?" he said. I said I was. He said he would be watchful. Harlan noticed. He started putting his hand near his pocket when he saw me, a little gesture like he was measuring distance. He began to make small, pointed comments in front of other guys. People fall when they're not paying attention, and we're a team, keep it together. The crew started to go quiet around me. I could feel them choosing sides without telling me. On the second to last day before supply, Harlan knocked a crate so it rolled across the deck and slammed into my shin. It wasn't hard, but it was deliberate enough to bruise and to let him say later, loud and in front of a few men, that I'd been clumsy and clumsy men don't make good witnesses. I kept my head down from then. I kept the notebook hidden. I kept the camera taped closed. The supply ship finally came in the gray, slamming up with a sound that makes men breathe better because it means contact with the outside world. Company security walked the platform with uniforms and a clipboard. The Coast Guard had one man out on the deck, a quiet guy with a heavy watch. I went to the medic and said I needed to hand over the little notebook and the camera, and I started to tell the story. Harlan waited until I was talking to company security and then came up like a man who had found a gospel. He said he had been with the platform for 15 years, that accidents happened, that Nate had been drunk on the catwalk. He polished his narrative like a hand polishes a tool. I felt the room tilt for a second because the company men wanted a simple explanation, wanted to be done. Then Marco walked up. He'd been with me the night I'd taken the photos. He said, "I saw it." A shove. Harlan pushed him. His voice was steady. 2 more guys nodded. The pile of small, quiet proofs I'd kept, the missing tool list, the anonymous note found shoved under a bunk, the camera I handed over despite trying to protect it, started to look like a chain. Company security paused, then radioed for the Coast Guard investigator to come up from the ship. The investigator came with a gravity in his face like a man who knows how slow paperwork can be but how fast the law can be when it moves. He took my camera and the memory card, and forensics took a look. They walked the pump room again, measured, noted, and then, finally, they asked Harlan to come to the security office. There was a long time when I thought it might not stick. A lot of little rigs have a culture of covering for their own, but the cart had enough. Shadowed frames of two bodies, a shove, a tumbling fall, and a glance that matched a fingerprint print they found on the pipe above the pit. Harlan was taken off the rig in a custody boat. He protested and then closed his mouth like someone who'd been counting on silence rather than evidence. The company spokesman said they were cooperating and that the investigation would play out on shore. That night the rig felt different. People moved more freely in the mass, and there were words like relief that tasted oddly like exhaustion. They flew me off on the supply helicopter the next day with a coat and a cup of instant coffee, and the Coast Guard said they made sure the charge was handled. I gave a statement that later felt smaller than it should have and bigger than any one person's courage. The formal arrest came 2 weeks later when the forensics and the investigators pushed the case to the prosecutor. Harlan was charged with manslaughter. The company placed 2 others on leave during the inquiry for obstruction. I left the platform with hands that still shook sometimes when I think about the weight of being stuck somewhere with a man who decided what your story would be. Easy justice doesn't always happen out there. It takes paperwork and witnesses and stubborn people who won't let a simple line be drawn. I didn't feel like a hero. I felt like a man who had kept a notebook and a camera and stayed alive long enough for someone to believe what he'd seen. I'd never been good with snow. Not the kind that falls soft and pretty, but the kind that presses down on you, dead quiet and heavy, like it's waiting for something. I learned the hard way on a trip up north last March, thinking I was ready for a few days on my snowmobile, miles from the nearest road, way past the last real town. I wasn't. The day started okay. The sun was low but bright, glinting off the drifts. My sled ran smooth, the motor hummed steady, and I felt that stupid invincible thing you get when you're alone and outdoors. I had a GPS strapped to my chest, a pack with enough food and water for 2 days, and a radio, though I knew the signal would be patchy at best. I figured that was fine. I'd done some research, watched some videos, thought I knew what I was doing. Around mid-afternoon, I tried a shortcut across a frozen creek. I didn't see the weak ice under a thin layer of new snow. The sled slipped, I hit a bank, and everything went sideways. I didn't black out, but I was jarred hard enough to know something was broken. The sled was okay, mostly, but my leg hurt like hell. I crawled out, checked my supplies, and tried the GPS. Nothing. Dead. Battery's fine, or at least showing fine, but the screen was frozen. The radio was worse, just static. I tried walking, dragging the sled a little, marking the snow behind me with sticks so I could retrace my steps if needed. I kept telling myself the town was only 25 miles away. Not far. I'd be fine. But that night came fast. The clouds rolled in, and a thin snowfall started, soft at first. By midnight, everything was blank, white, and silent. My tracks. Gone. Every mark I'd made erased. The sticks. Buried. I was suddenly completely blind in a place that had felt manageable just hours before. I hunkered down near a clump of spruce, trying to get warm, my leg throbbing. I wrapped myself in every layer I had, tried to eat, but the food was frozen solid. I could hear the wind shifting in the trees, strange little cracks and pops, nothing like the wind back home. Something was moving out there, I knew it. Not snow settling. Not the wind. It started small. A rustle. A snap of a branch. Every time I tried to see what it was, nothing. Then I started hearing them, low, deliberate footsteps, pacing just beyond the tree line. Wolves, maybe, I told myself. Bears. Could be nothing. But the sound of a predator moving in the snow is different. Precise. Calculated. I lay very still and tried to remember everything I knew about being hunted in the wild. Keep calm. Make no sudden movements. Don't breathe loud. Hours passed. I don't know how many. The snow fell steady, covering my little shelter, muffling every sound except for the thump of my own heart. I tried moving again in the morning, slow, careful, but the snow had erased my route entirely. I couldn't tell creek from bank, hill from hollow. Every time I thought I found a path, it ended in a wall of deep snow or a drift taller than me. I was trapped in a maze of white, and the footsteps kept circling. Always circling. I tried shouting once, stupidly, just to see if anything would respond. Nothing. Silence swallowed the sound of my voice. That was worse than the footsteps. Alone, alone, alone. I tried the GPS again. Dead. I tried the radio. Static. I didn't even cry. I just kept moving. One foot, then the other, dragging the sled, dragging myself. At some point, I realized I had to make a decision. Stay and hope someone comes, or keep moving and hope I find the road. I chose moving. Pain screaming in my leg, every muscle screaming, but moving forward seemed less like death than staying. By afternoon, I saw trees thin out. My arms ached. My legs screamed. My face was raw with cold. The circling footsteps? They hadn't stopped. I couldn't tell if it was one wolf, two, a pack. I caught glimpses of black shapes between the trees sometimes, blurred and fast. I stopped counting. I stumbled into a frozen creek and realized the sled was useless for a while. I had to abandon it. I wrapped my food in layers of my jacket and tied it to my back. I was desperate. The snow had turned wet now, sticking to everything, weighing me down. I could hear the creek cracking under ice. Not a sound I wanted to test. Evening came, faster than I wanted. I kept hearing the footsteps. Sometimes it sounded like they were right behind me. I ran, stupidly, falling half the time. I remember seeing a shadow move across the snow, too fast for a person, too deliberate for a deer. Wolves, maybe, but I don't know. I never saw teeth, never saw eyes, just the shapes moving in the white. I thought about stopping, hiding, making a last stand. But there was no wood for a fire, no shelter, nothing but snow and trees and shadows. So I kept going. One foot, then the other, screaming inside at every crunch, every crack, every sound. Night came again. I was completely exhausted, limping, almost crawling at times. I thought I might freeze before the wolves ever reached me. But then I saw lights. Dim at first, far off, but they were there. The highway. Not the town, not my goal yet, but civilization. I stumbled toward it, half running, half dragging my body across the crusted snow. The lights moved closer. Cars, people, voices. The footsteps didn't follow anymore, or maybe they did and I just didn't notice. I collapsed on the road, bleeding from small cuts, frozen, shaking. Someone screamed and ran toward me. A heater, blankets, hot coffee, a radio call. I tried to explain the snow, the tracks, the shapes, the circling. They just nodded, maybe not believing, maybe just relieved I was alive. They got me to the emergency cabin in town. I was shaking, hypothermic, dehydrated. They took my leg, checked for frostbite. I slept for hours. Hours I couldn't measure. I never went back for the sled. It's still out there, buried somewhere in a snowdrift with its tracks erased. I keep thinking about the shadows, the shapes moving just beyond sight, the feeling of being watched when there's nothing there. I survived. I made it to people. But out there, in the white, alone, moving blindly, knowing someone or something was circling, it's not a feeling you shake off. It's not just cold. It's the knowledge that you are close to being just another erasure in the snow. And sometimes, when the wind presses against the windows at night, I think I can still hear footsteps circling just beyond the tree line, waiting. I never expected to see something like that in Alaska. I've lived in remote towns before, small places where everyone knows everyone and nothing ever really happens, but this town was different. Less than 200 people, scattered along a dirt road and surrounded by endless spruce and frozen rivers. It was quiet, so quiet that even the faintest sound gets noticed. I first started paying attention to my neighbor about a month after I moved in. The guy kept to himself mostly, but his house was weirdly maintained, lights on at all hours, garbage piling up in the corner of the yard, and sometimes a faint smell in the air that didn't belong to anything natural. I didn't think much of it at first. Old houses in Alaska get smells, mold, old food, even gas sometimes. The noises started small. At first, I could swear it was just the wind. A creak in the floor, a soft thump from downstairs. Then one night, I was sitting in my kitchen, reading by flashlight because the power had gone out again, and I heard something that made me freeze. It was a low, guttural moan. Human, I realized almost immediately, but weak, broken, scared. I listened for hours. Nothing else. Maybe I imagined it. I wanted to tell myself that. The next few nights, the noises got louder. Whimpering, chains dragging, muffled voices. Always at night, always faint. I started checking my doors and windows obsessively, making sure nothing had slipped through. The wind? It didn't make chains rattle. The snow didn't make guttural moans. Then the smell came. It was faint at first, like something rotting behind the walls, but it got stronger over time. My dog wouldn't go near the fence line that touched his property. He'd growl, hack, even whine sometimes. That's when I started thinking maybe something was wrong. Not just strange. Wrong. I asked around town. People shrugged. He keeps to himself. Probably just some pets. I got the sense they didn't want to talk about him, like there was a rule to just let it slide. I didn't push too hard at first. Small towns have long memories, and I didn't want him noticing me asking questions. One night, I stayed up on the porch, hidden under a blanket, watching his house. I wanted to see if anything happened, see if the noises were just in my head. Around midnight, the basement window, the one half buried in snow, had a flicker of movement. A shadow moved past. I couldn't make out a person, but the chains? I saw them drag across the floor. My stomach went cold. I tried rationalizing. Maybe he worked on old machinery, welding or something, and the noises carried. But the smell, the shadows, the way the chains clinked, it didn't add up. A week later, I had enough. I went out during the day, pretending to check the fence line near his house. I waited until the wind carried my scent away, and then I itched closer, trying to peek in a small window at the basement. The glass was frosted over, but I could see movement. A person, or maybe two. They were thin, shivering, tangled in chains. I didn't scream. I couldn't. I had to make sure I wasn't imagining it. I went home, my hands shaking, my mind racing. I called the state police. The town sheriff wasn't much of a man, knew the guy, probably wouldn't do anything. The state officer said they'd send someone immediately. I had to wait, though. Helicopters don't just fly at a moment's notice in winter. Hours passed like days. I kept checking, making sure the neighbor didn't see me outside, didn't catch me watching. That night, around 2 a.m., the noises got worse. Screams now, full-blown terror. I almost called it off, worried that if he heard me, he'd do something to them. But the officer said to stay put and keep watching until backup arrived. I watched from the tree line as they came. State police, dressed in black, breaking through the snow, guns ready. They surrounded the house. The neighbor ran toward the back door, screaming. He was fast, but he slipped in the snow. They tackled him, cuffed him, and dragged him to the patrol car. They didn't tell me much until the next morning. The basement, what I saw was real. 3 people, 2 women and a man, chained and frozen in the corner. One of the women had bruises all over her arms. The man's clothes were shredded in places from trying to escape. They were scared beyond reason but alive. The state officer said he had been keeping them there for months, demanding money, threatening them, telling them no one would come for them out here. The smell I noticed? Decomposition from the rats and spoiled food he'd left down there. The lone moans? Exhaustion, hunger, fear, the human body under absolute duress. The chains weren't just for show, they had been there since he caught them. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept thinking about how quiet the town was before all this came out, how people shrugged off the smells, the noises. How small towns sometimes turn blind eyes to keep the peace. I kept thinking about those faces, the raw terror frozen in their eyes when the officers pulled them out. I kept thinking about how close I had been to witnessing something worse. It took months for the survivors to recover enough to talk. They never wanted to leave town, and the authorities set them up in another remote area with protection. The neighbor? Convicted. Sentenced. I don't want to know the details, but the court records were enough. The house is empty now, boarded up. Sometimes I go past it and see the snow drifting over the windows, undisturbed, silent. It feels heavier than the other abandoned houses nearby, as if it's carrying the memory of the people chained inside. I still live here, but I don't walk near the house at night. Even during the day, I can feel something off, like it remembers. Like it knows I saw. It's Alaska. It's supposed to be quiet, peaceful, remote. But some things can hide anywhere, and sometimes it takes being alert, being brave, or being lucky just to notice before it's too late. I was lucky. That's all I keep telling myself. I walk past the town on my way to work now, past the empty cabins and frozen rivers, past the trees that hide secrets. I think about the sound of chains dragging across a cold, hard floor, the smell that made me gag, the shadow of a human barely moving under dim light. And I don't forget. I can't. Even now, months later, I still check the fence line when I walk by his property, even though it's empty. Because I know what humans can do when no one's watching, and I know that in a town this small, sometimes being quiet is the only thing keeping you alive.